She was drunk, stranded, and not his problem. He could have driven away. He should have driven away. But the moment that door opened and he saw her, Mason Reed's carefully rebuilt life cracked straight down the middle. What followed wasn't a fairy tale. It was messier than that. More painful. More real. And it almost destroyed everything he had left. If you've ever loved someone who made you feel like chaos was normal, this story is for you. Stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The rain came without warning. 1 minute, the sky above Hartwell City was that flat, bruised purple that late October always brought. The kind of color that made you feel like something was about to go wrong without being able to say exactly what. The next minute, it was a wall of water dropping straight down from nowhere. The kind of rain that didn't care about your umbrella or your plans or the fact that you had a kid at home waiting on you. Mason Reed was already tired before any of it started. He'd been tired for about 3 years running, if he was being honest with himself, which he tried to be most of the time, because dishonesty required energy he didn't have. 32 years old, single father to an 8-year-old boy named Caleb, owner of a small custom furniture workshop on the eastern edge of the city called Reed and Grain. The name had been his ex-wife Sabrina's idea, back when she still pretended to care about what he built. She'd thought it sounded distinguished. He'd kept the name after the divorce because changing it cost money he didn't have, and because honestly, he'd stopped caring about things like that somewhere around the 4th time she'd screamed at him for working late. Tonight he'd worked late again. Not because Sabrina was around to scream at him, she hadn't been, not for 14 months, but because a dining table commission had a deadline and the walnut surface needed one more pass with the hand plane before he could feel right about it. Caleb was at his mother's, Mason's mother, not Sabrina. That distinction mattered. And so there was no one waiting, no reason to rush. And the workshop was the one place in the world where Mason felt something close to competent. He'd left around 9:30. The call came at 9:47. He almost didn't answer. The number wasn't saved, and Mason had a personal policy about unknown numbers at night. They were never good news. But something made him pick up. Maybe just loneliness wearing the costume of curiosity. And the voice on the other end was young, female, and thoroughly drunk. Hey, is this Marcus? No. Oh. A pause, laughter in the background, music, the specific chaos of a party that had gone on 3 hours too long. Are you sure? Pretty sure. My name is Mason. Oh. She seemed to find this genuinely funny. Okay, so I called the wrong person. That happens. That's fine. Hey, wait, do you know where Dalton Avenue is? I need a ride, and the app isn't working because my phone, a crash. More laughter. Sorry, I'm okay. The app isn't... Where are you right now? Mason asked, before he could think about why he was asking. She was at a party in the Meridian district, she said, about 4 miles from where he was sitting. She'd come with friends, but the friends had either left or were too drunk themselves to drive, and her rideshare app kept failing because her screen was cracked. And apparently the rain was messing with the GPS, and she really just needed to get home. And she wasn't like dangerous or anything. She was just a little, Mason repeated. Okay, a medium amount drunk. I know that's not better. I can pay you. He should have said no. Any reasonable person, any sensible, self-preserving adult would have said no. He was tired. It was raining. He had no connection to this woman, owed her nothing, didn't know her name or her face, or whether she was actually who she said she was, or some kind of setup for something worse. He pulled out of the workshop parking lot 6 minutes later and drove toward Meridian. He found her on the front steps of a brownstone with glass-paneled balconies, sitting with her knees pulled up to her chest, a small leather bag clutched in her lap, and her dark hair so soaked through that it was plastered flat against her cheekbones. She was wearing a green dress that was too thin for October, and heels she'd clearly given up on. They were hanging from 2 fingers of her left hand while she sat in bare feet on wet concrete. She looked up when his headlights hit her. 22, maybe 23, pretty in the unfinished way that very young people are pretty. All potential and angles, not quite settled into herself yet. Her eye makeup had run down far enough to make her look like she'd been crying, which maybe she had been. He couldn't tell. She squinted at him. Are you Mason? That's what I've been told. She laughed, which surprised him. He hadn't meant it to be funny. Okay, I'm Jade. Thanks for... you didn't have to... Where do you live? She gave him an address on Carver Hill, a neighborhood he knew vaguely, newer money, the kind of tall, modern houses that showed up in architectural magazines but always felt slightly hollow to him, too much glass and not enough wood. She climbed into the passenger seat and immediately said, "Sorry about the water," as a small puddle formed beneath her on the leather seat. "It's a work truck. Still." She looked around at the cab. Tool bags wedged between the seats, a measuring tape on the dashboard, sawdust in the door pocket, the permanent smell of cut wood and linseed oil that Mason had long since stopped noticing. "What do you do?" "I build furniture." "Like tables and stuff?" "Tables and stuff." She nodded seriously the way drunk people nod when they're trying very hard to seem sober. "That's cool. That's a real thing. That's like, you make things that actually exist." She pointed at the windshield. "Most people I know make things that only exist on a screen. I think that's kind of sad." Mason didn't respond to that. He turned onto the main arterial and drove through rain that was now so heavy the wipers could barely keep up. Jade fell quiet, which he was grateful for. She looked out the passenger window at the blurred lights of the city going past, and eventually her head tipped against the glass, and he thought she might fall asleep. She didn't. "I'm sorry," she said after a while. Quieter this time. The drunk edges had smoothed out a little, leaving something more genuine underneath. "You don't know me, and you came out in this. That was—" She stopped. "My friends were supposed to eat." She stopped again. "Never mind. I'm not going to make excuses for them. You don't have to explain anything. I just want you to know I don't usually do this. Okay? I'm not usually the girl who needs saving. I hate being the girl who needs saving." Mason glanced at her briefly. "You called a stranger for a ride in the rain. That's not being saved. That's problem solving." She turned to look at him. Something shifted in her expression. Something he couldn't quite name. "Okay," she said. "Okay. I like that." Well, the address she gave him turned out to be on a long private lane off Carver Hill Road. The kind of lane that didn't announce itself, with a row of established oaks lining both sides and a low stone wall that said private property without needing an actual sign. Mason had grown up on the east side of Hartwell, in a neighborhood where the houses sat 12 feet from each other, and you could hear your neighbors' arguments through the walls. This felt like another city entirely. The house at the end of the lane was large. Not aggressively large, not the kind of new money square footage that was purely about intimidation, but substantial, wide, with a covered porch across the entire front face and warm light in the downstairs windows that gave it a specific quality of being genuinely occupied rather than just expensive. He pulled up to the front steps and put the truck in park. Jade was already reaching into her bag, pulling out her wallet with the careful focus of someone doing math in their head. "How much, Nothing." She looked up. "What?" "Don't worry about it." "Mason, I'm not going to let you drive out in this for nothing. That's ridiculous." "Jade." He said her name for the first time, and something about it made her go still. "It's fine. Go inside. You're wet and it's cold." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't read. Part gratitude, part something sharper. And then she nodded. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. She got out of the truck, stepped up to the front porch, and rang the doorbell. Mason was already putting the truck back in drive. The rain was getting worse. He could hear it battering the roof now, a sound like static turned up too high, and the windshield was fogging from the temperature difference between inside and out. He was thinking about the drive home, about whether the underpass on Clement would be flooded, about whether Caleb would ask about him when he called his mother's house in the morning. The front door opened. He wasn't planning to look. There was no reason to look. But movement at the edge of his peripheral vision made him glance up, just for a second, and the second was enough. The woman in the doorway was not what he expected. He hadn't expected anything, which made the reality of her hit harder. She was tall, nearly as tall as the doorframe, and she was wearing a dark-colored button-up shirt over fitted trousers as though she'd just come from work or had never really stopped. Her hair was pulled back. Her face was— Mason would struggle to describe it later, in the way that you sometimes struggle to describe things that affect you in ways you don't have language for yet. Composed, not cold. There was a difference between composed and cold, and she was entirely one and completely not the other. She looked at Jade, taking in the wet dress, the bare feet, the ruined makeup, and her expression didn't cycle through shock or judgment, or the particular kind of exasperation that set again. It just settled into something practical and warm, and she pulled Jade gently inside and said something too quiet for Mason to hear. Then, and this was the part he'd think about later, she looked past Jade's shoulder and directly at him. Not in the way people glanced at strangers. Actually, at him. At his truck. At the rain coming down sideways behind him. At the fact that he was still there instead of already leaving. She said something to Jade. Jade turned around and made a gesture with her hand. Wait. And then the woman in the doorway walked off the porch and down the 3 front steps into the actual rain without an umbrella, walked to the driver's side of his truck, and knocked twice on the window. Mason rolled it down. She looked at him steadily. Rain was landing in her hair, but she didn't seem to notice or care. Up close she was. He put her at roughly his age, maybe a year or 2 younger, 30 or 31, and her eyes were the precise, unhurried kind of dark that made him feel like she was reading more than just his face. "Thank you for bringing her home," she said. Her voice was even. No performance in it. "It's fine. The weather's getting worse. You're welcome to wait it out inside if you want. I have coffee." No hesitation in the offer, no calculation in it. Just a statement of available options, take it or leave it. The sensible thing, the careful, self-protective thing that Mason Reed had spent 3 years training himself to do, was to say thanks, but I should get back. "Coffee sounds good," he said. Her name was Victoria Hale. He found that out about 10 minutes after stepping through the front door, which was not the first thing he noticed about the inside of her house. The first thing he noticed was that it felt lived in, which surprised him given its size. Not in a messy way, in a real way. There were architectural drawings on the large kitchen table, rolled and weighted with coffee mugs, a pair of reading glasses on the arm of the couch, books on actual shelves, not arranged for appearance, but stacked and doubled up in the practical chaos of someone who ran out of room because they kept buying more. A child's drawing, framed, which seemed important, on the wall near the kitchen entrance. He stood in the entryway, self-conscious about the sawdust in his clothes, and the rain dripping from his jacket onto a floor that probably cost more than his monthly rent. "Don't worry about the floor," she said, without looking back at him, already moving toward the kitchen. "Leave the jacket on the hook if you want." He did. Jade had disappeared upstairs with a towel and a change of clothes that Victoria had produced without ceremony, apparently from some stockpile of practical preparation. Mason sat at one end of the kitchen table, carefully not disturbing the drawings, and watched Victoria Hale make coffee. She moved in her own kitchen the way people moved when they were comfortable being alone. Not performing ease, just actually at ease. She pulled 2 mugs from a cabinet, found a third for Jade, set them down without fuss. She asked him how he took his "black is fine," and didn't make a comment about it like people sometimes did, just nodded and poured. She set his mug down in front of him, moved the nearest rolled drawing a few inches to give him table space, and sat down across from him. "What's your name?" she asked. "Mason. Mason Reed." "Victoria Hale." She reached across the table and shook his hand, which felt oddly formal and also completely right. Her handshake was firm, brief, meant it. "Who is Jade to you?" "No one. She called the wrong number." Victoria looked at him steadily. "And you came anyway." "I was already out. The rain was—" He stopped. He didn't actually have a great explanation for why he'd done it. He'd just done it. "I have a kid," he said, finally, which wasn't exactly an explanation, but was the closest thing to one he had. "I think about what I'd want someone to do if it were him." Something in her expression shifted slightly. Not much. She wasn't the kind of person who showed things loudly, but something. "How old?" she asked. 8. His name is Caleb. "Is he with you tonight?" "His grandmother's. I was working late." He looked down at his coffee, then back up. "You're related to Jade." "She's my cousin, youngest of 5. A brief pause. "The most likely to end up on a stranger's doorstep in the rain." "She seems like a good person," Mason said. He believed it, which was maybe why he said it. Victoria considered this for a moment, like she was actually weighing the evidence. "She is," she said. "She makes bad decisions with good intentions, which is better than the reverse." Mason thought about that. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, that's true." That was the first real thing they agreed on. He remembered it later. The rain didn't let up. What had been supposed to be a cup of coffee in 20 minutes turned into something else. Victoria received 2 work emails she apologized for answering and answered anyway. Something about a permit delay on a project in the North Shore corridor. And Mason found himself looking at the architectural drawings spread across the end of the table without quite meaning to. His eye went to the details, the way it always did. The way the structural elements intersected, the joints and load points, things other people's eyes slid past. "You can look if you want," Victoria said, without looking up from her screen. "I don't mind." He reached over and gently unrolled the nearest one, holding it flat with both palms. A residential interior, large kitchen, open plan to the living space, a custom built-in shelving unit along one entire wall. His eye went immediately to the shelving. "This joinery here," he said, "the corner detail." Victoria looked up. "What about it?" "The way it's drawn. It can't be done the way this reads. Not structurally." He turned the drawing toward her and pointed. "If you use a standard box joint here, at this corner, the weight distribution from the upper shelves will stress the connection at the base. Over time, over years, it fails." She didn't get defensive. She looked at where he was pointing. "What would you do instead?" "Mortise and tenon, with a floating panel in the back to handle the racking. Adds about 2 days of build time, but it holds forever. If you want, I can show you." He reached automatically for the pencil that was clipped to her drawing tube and then stopped. "Sorry, that was... no." She was looking at him differently now, not dramatically, just with more attention than before. "Show me." He showed her, lightly, in pencil, on the edge of the drawing where there was margin. The modification to the joint, the structural logic behind it, why it worked. He'd done this kind of thing his whole working life, explained construction decisions to people who didn't think in materials, and he'd gotten good at it, found ways to make the logic tangible. Victoria Hale followed his explanation without needing him to slow down. She asked one precise question, about wood movement across the grain and whether the floating panel solution accounted for seasonal expansion. And it was exactly the right question, the one a person asked only if they understood the basics already and wanted to push further. "You know something about construction," he said. "My degree is in architectural design. I've spent 15 years learning how things are built in theory." She looked at his pencil marks on the drawing. "What you just described is practice. They're not always the same thing." "No," he said, "they're really not." Jade came back downstairs at that point, in borrowed sweatpants and a dry shirt, looking sheepishly better than she had an hour ago. She stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked between Mason and Victoria with the puzzled expression of someone who'd expected to return to polite awkwardness and had instead found something she couldn't quite categorize. "Are you two talking about architecture?" she said. "Furniture joinery," Mason said. "It's 11:15, Jade said, "in the rain." "The road through the Clement underpass is probably flooded," Victoria said, in the same even tone she used for everything. "You should stay until it clears. Jade can get towels for the guest room." "I don't need..." "Mason." She said his name the same way he'd said Jade's earlier, direct, without pressure, just making a statement. "The road floods. You know it does. I can see it on your face. Stay until it clears. There's no performance attached to the offer." Jade raised her eyebrows slightly at that last sentence. Victoria didn't look at her. Mason looked at his coffee mug, which was empty. He looked at the rain against the kitchen window, which was not. "Okay," he said. "I'll get towels," Jade said, and disappeared again. And Mason was alone in the kitchen with Victoria Hale, the rain against the windows, and the drawings on the table between them. And something else he couldn't name yet. Something quiet and unannounced that he wouldn't think to look for until it was already there. He slept in the guest room, which was clean and simple and had one of those windows that was positioned to frame a specific piece of sky. He noticed the window before he noticed anything else. He lay on top of the covers in his work clothes because sleeping in a stranger's house in your work clothes was a line he could maintain, and he listened to the rain. He thought about Caleb. He always thought about Caleb, the specific shape of his kid's face when he was sleeping. 7 going on 8, still small enough to take up only half a twin bed, old enough to have opinions about everything. Caleb had his mother's eyes, which Mason had once loved and now just noticed. The way you notice things that had stopped hurting and started just being true. He thought about Sabrina. He tried not to, but the thinking happened on its own in the dark quiet of an unfamiliar room, the way it did. Sabrina, who he'd married at 27 because she was electric and he'd confused electricity for warmth. Sabrina, who could make a room turn toward her like plants toward light, and who could then decide in the same afternoon to make that same room feel airless and small. Sabrina, who had told him, the week she left, that he was boring, that he'd never given her anything real, that his idea of love was just showing up and fixing things. And that wasn't love, Mason. That was just maintenance. He'd believed her for a while. That was the part he found hardest to say out loud. Not that she'd said it, but that he'd believed it. That he'd stood in their kitchen at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, holding the keys she'd just thrown at him, and thought, maybe she's right. Maybe I don't know how to love people the way they need. He'd spent 14 months trying to figure out if that was true. Lying in the dark in Victoria Hale's guest room, listening to the rain ease from violent to ordinary, he found he wasn't thinking about that question anymore. That was new. Morning arrived gray and washed and lighter than the night, the way mornings after serious rain always did. Mason woke before 6, old habit. Caleb was a 5:50 riser and the body adapted. He found his way to the kitchen, prepared to be quietly awkward about the whole thing, and found Victoria Hale already at the counter. She looked at him and said, "I was going to make eggs. Do you eat eggs?" Not good morning, which he might have found formal. Not, "Oh, good, you're up," which he would have found hollow. Just the direct, practical question of whether eggs were on the table, and he found he was grateful for it in a way he couldn't quite explain. "Yeah," he said, "I eat eggs." "Good." She pulled a pan from the cabinet. "Sit down." The kitchen was easier in daylight, bigger and also somehow less intimidating. The architectural drawings still spread across the table, a coffee maker already running, actual morning sounds of the house settling and the traffic beginning outside. The rain had stopped completely. The oaks along the lane were dripping in the early light. He sat at the table and she made eggs, scrambled, with something in them he couldn't immediately identify. Turned out to be a small amount of cream cheese, of all things, which shouldn't have worked as well as it did. She put toast on while the eggs cooked, poured him coffee, sat down across from him with her own plate. They ate in silence for the first few minutes. Not uncomfortable silence. Not the silence that needed filling. The kind of silence that two people fall into when they don't feel the need to perform for each other. "Your work," she said eventually. "You said custom furniture, residential, commercial?" "Both. Residential mostly. I've done some commercial, restaurant interiors, a hotel lobby a few years ago, but I prefer individual pieces. The commission work." He turned his fork in his hand without thinking about it, the same habitual motion he did in the workshop when he was thinking. You get to know what someone actually needs rather than what they think they want. What's the difference? People come in asking for a coffee table. What they actually need is a surface low enough for their kid to reach, with rounded corners because the kid is 4 and drawers underneath because the living room doesn't have storage. The coffee table they saw in a magazine doesn't do any of that. So you build what they need and call it what they asked for. Victoria looked at him. "You do that with people," she said. "Not just furniture." He wasn't sure what to say to that. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "That was too much. We just met." "No," he said, and then wasn't sure what the no was supposed to be followed by. He turned the fork again. "No, I think you're... Yeah, I do that. I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing." "Probably both," she said, and it was honest enough that he laughed, which surprised him. She smiled at the laugh. Briefly, contained. She smiled the way she did everything, without excess. But it was real. He could tell. "What do you build when you're not building for someone else?" she asked. The question landed differently than he expected. No one asked him that. His mother asked about his health. His workshop assistant Darnell asked about the project schedule. His friends, what was left of them after the divorce had rearranged his social world completely, asked about Caleb, or about Sabrina, or about whether he was doing okay, which was a question that always meant doing better than the last time we asked. No one asked what he built for himself. "A chest," he said. "Been working on it for about 8 months. Cherry wood, hand-cut dovetails, hand-carved panel inserts. It'll probably take another 4 months at the rate I'm going." He paused. "There's no commission on it, no deadline. He stopped, trying to find the right word. "I need to know I can still make something that isn't for anyone but itself. That it exists because I made it, not because someone needed it. She had stopped eating. She was looking at him with that same quality of attention she'd turned on him the night before. The kind that didn't feel like being studied, but like being seen, which was different enough to matter. I understand that, she said quietly. What do you build for yourself? He asked. She was quiet for a moment. I haven't, she said, for a long time. She looked past him toward the window. Everything I've built has been for something. A commission, a client, a deadline, a company. I stopped noticing when I stopped making anything just because I wanted to. The honesty of it cost her something. He could see that. The way her jaw shifted slightly, the way she looked back down at her plate like she hadn't meant to say that much. That was too much again, she said. No, Mason said. It wasn't. He left at 8:45. Jade was still asleep, which Victoria reported without editorializing. She just said she's still out and nodded toward the ceiling, and Mason understood that Jade had a history of sleeping late, and Victoria had a history of letting her. At the front door, he put on his jacket, which was mostly dry. Victoria stood in the doorway, same place she'd been last night, when he'd looked up and seen her for the first time, and handed him a business card. If you're ever looking for commercial work, she said, my firm handles a lot of interior design projects. We don't have a consistent furniture fabricator. The one we used last year was a pause, a small compression of her mouth. Difficult. Difficult how? He took the deposit and delivered 6 weeks late, and the piece wasn't what was specified. I had to apologize to the client personally. She said this very matter-of-factly, but something in her voice was tight underneath. I don't apologize for other people's failures twice. No, he said. I imagine you don't. He took the card. It was simple. Victoria Hale, CEO, Hale Design Group, the address and number, and a small geometric logo in the corner. Thank you for the eggs, he said, and the coffee, and the room. Thank you for bringing Jade home. She paused. And for the joint detail, on the drawing. He smiled, small, the way he did when something caught him off guard in a good way. That'll hold better now. I know, she said, not proudly, just as a fact. He walked down the 3 front steps to the lane. The oaks were still wet, dripping cold water onto the gravel. His truck looked completely out of place under them, practical and beat up and smelling of sawdust, against the backdrop of this house, this lane, this life that was not his. He got in the truck. He put the business card on the dashboard. He looked at it for a moment. Then he started the engine and drove back out through the Oaks and onto Carver Hill Road and toward the east side of the city, where his workshop waited and his tools waited, and the half-finished cherry chest waited, and the ordinary, patched-together, forward-moving shape of his life waited. He didn't let himself think about the card on the dashboard. He let himself think about it anyway. The thing about Mason Reed was that he had become, over the course of 14 months of single fatherhood, a person who was very good at not wanting things. He'd learned it practically, the way he'd learned most things in his life, through necessity rather than philosophy. When you were responsible for a child on your own and trying to keep a small business running and living in a 2-bedroom apartment on the eastern side of a city that didn't owe you anything, the smart play was to manage your appetite, want less, expect less, be grateful for what held and careful about what you reached for. He'd applied this logic to his professional life without much trouble. He turned down commissions he couldn't execute well, took fewer jobs at higher quality rather than the reverse, kept Reed and Grain small enough to control. He'd applied it to his social life with more effort and less success. The friend group had shrunk. He didn't date. He went to Caleb's school things and his mother's Sunday dinners and the occasional drink with Darnell, and he called that a life. He had not yet figured out how to apply it to the part of him that had looked up through a rain-blurred windshield at a woman in a doorway and felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. He tried, though. The card sat on the dashboard of his truck for 4 days. He called on the 5th day, at 11 in the morning, from the workshop, between the morning espresso and the delivery of the walnut dining table. Victoria answered on the 2nd ring. Reed and Grain, she said, because she'd saved his number or read the cards he'd apparently once left at the hardware supply place where she bought materials. He wasn't sure which. I was wondering when you'd call. Was it going to matter, the timing, he asked. A little, she said. 4 days is thoughtful. 3 days is eager. 5 days is indifferent. A beat. 4 days is about right. He wasn't sure if she was teasing him or being honest. He suspected correctly that it was both. I have a client who's looking for a custom bookshelf, she said, moving on without letting him respond to that. Walnut, floor-to-ceiling, integrated lighting in the upper section. I can send you the specs. Send them, he said. She did. The specs were detailed, precise, intelligent. They showed someone who understood what she was asking for and had thought through the implications. There were 2 places where the specifications needed refinement. He marked them, returned the document with notes, and waited. Her response came in 20 minutes. You're right on both. Can you do a site visit Thursday? He could do a site visit Thursday. That was how it started, in the architecture of small things. The way most real things started, not with a moment, but with a sequence of moments that only revealed their shape in retrospect. Thursday's site visit was professional and functional and lasted 45 minutes longer than it needed to because they stopped talking about the bookshelf and started talking about the house. Saturday, he came back with wood samples. The following Thursday, he began the build. He worked at her property 3 mornings a week for the next 3 weeks. Victoria was usually working from her home office during that time. He could hear her on calls, the measured cadence of her voice giving direction or receiving information, the way she phrased things precisely without being cold about it. She came down during breaks and they drank coffee and talked, not about anything large, about her project in North Shore and the permit still being delayed, about Caleb, who had decided he wanted to learn to build things and had been assigned the task of sanding the offcuts in the workshop on weekends, which he found both terrifying and delightful. About her father, once, briefly, the day Mason noticed the framed photograph on the shelf in the living room, a man with her same composed face and careful eyes, and she said he died 6 years ago, with a matter-of-factness that told him it still cost her, but that she'd learned to carry the cost. He didn't push. She didn't push. There was something they were both holding back from, some edge they circled without approaching, and the circling itself felt like something, though he couldn't have said what. The bookshelf was finished on a Friday afternoon in early November. He stood back and looked at it, floor to ceiling, walnut, the integrated lighting making it warm in the way that only well-matched materials with well-cut joints could achieve, the kind of warm that wasn't about voltage, but about craft. The corner joinery he'd mentioned on that first night was right. It would hold for decades. Victoria stood next to him and looked at it. It's exactly right, she said quietly. I know. She looked at him. He looked at her. They were standing close enough that he was aware of it, close enough that the next thing that happened would either be something or nothing, and the difference between those outcomes was currently balanced on a razor's edge. I want to pay you, she said. We already agreed on a price. I want to pay you more than we agreed. No, he said it simply. The price we agreed is fair. I'm not going to take more than fair. She studied him. Most people would take the extra. I know. Why won't you? Because... He stopped, started again. Because I don't want money to be part of what this is. A pause. What is this? She asked. He wasn't ready to answer that. He wasn't sure he had the answer yet, or that he had the words for the answer, even if he had the answer. He was a man who worked in wood, who understood weight and structure and the way things fit together when the dimensions were right, and he did not have a working vocabulary for this particular kind of fit. I don't know yet, he said, but I'd like to figure it out. Victoria looked at the bookshelf for a moment. Then she looked back at him. Okay, she said, and that was enough for now. He drove home in the early dark of a November evening with sawdust in his collar and the receipt for the completed job in his pocket, and something tentative and terrifying and entirely unlike anything he'd let himself feel in 3 years, moving quietly through his chest like a door he hadn't yet decided whether to open. His phone buzzed in the cup holder. He glanced at it at a red light, a text from a number that wasn't saved anymore, though he recognized it immediately. I heard you've been spending time at that woman's house. We need to talk. The light turned green. Mason Reed put the phone face down on the seat and drove. The door in his chest, the one he hadn't decided about, swung very slightly open on its own. He didn't close it. The text from Sabrina sat in his phone like a splinter, small enough to ignore, specific enough to keep catching. Mason didn't answer it that night. He drove home, made dinner for himself because Caleb was at his mother's until Sunday, ate standing at the kitchen counter the way he always did when it was just him, and then sat on the couch with the television on without watching it. The text stayed unread in the notification bar at the top of his screen. He knew the words already. I heard you've been spending time at that woman's house. We need to talk. And he knew that reading them again wouldn't change what they said or what they meant. What they meant was that Sabrina had sources. What they meant was that whatever space he'd been quietly building for himself over the last 3 weeks had a leak in it somewhere. What they meant was that the particular kind of peace he'd found, tentative, fragile, the kind that required careful conditions to survive, had already been noticed by the person most likely to disrupt it. He turned the television off at 9:30 and went to bed and lay there thinking about Victoria's face when she'd looked at the finished bookshelf. The way she'd said it's exactly right, not I love it or it's beautiful, both of which would have been perfectly reasonable things to say, but exactly right, which was a specific and precise form of appreciation that matched the way she looked at everything, and which landed somewhere different than a compliment would have. He did not text Sabrina back. He fell asleep thinking about walnut and the color of warm light through good wood, which was better than what he usually fell asleep thinking about. Sunday morning, Caleb came home with his grandmother at 10 o'clock and immediately began describing in extraordinary detail a nature documentary he'd watched twice at her house about deep-sea fish with bioluminescence. Mason made pancakes and listened to all of it. The anglerfish, the specific depth at which light stopped working, the fact that some of those fish had never once in their entire lives seen actual sunlight, and felt the particular grounding that his son provided without knowing he was providing it. Caleb was the most efficient thing Mason knew for making the world's scale correct. Not smaller exactly, just correctly proportioned. "Dad," Caleb said, around his third pancake, "can we go to the workshop today? You have homework." "I did it at Grandma's." Mason looked at him. "All of it?" "The math for sure. The reading thing is due Wednesday. The reading thing is a book report. It's due Wednesday." Mason considered this with the resigned arithmetic of a parent who had learned to pick battles. 2 hours in the workshop, he said. Then you do the book report. Caleb's face opened up in the specific way it did when something worked out better than expected, wide and unguarded, and 8 years old in a way that still sometimes caught Mason off guard. The reminder that underneath the opinions and the negotiating and the increasingly sophisticated arguments, there was still just a kid who wanted to spend time with his father. They drove to the workshop at noon. Mason had a small side table to finish, a commission for a regular client, simple piece, cherrywood, just needed the final fit checked and the hardware installed. He let Caleb sand the underside of the shelf where no one would ever see it, which Caleb did with the serious focus of someone performing surgery, and while his son sanded, Mason thought about the text he still hadn't answered and decided he wasn't going to. Not that day, and not because he was afraid of what Sabrina wanted to say. More because he'd spent 3 years allowing Sabrina to define the terms of their interactions, and one of the things he'd decided, quietly, without announcing it to anyone, just as a private adjustment to the way he moved through the world, was that he wasn't doing that anymore. She could wait, or she could not. The outcome of either wasn't his to manage. He turned the hardware plate in his hands, checked the alignment, reached for the screwdriver. Caleb looked up from his sanding. "Dad, did you know that some deep-sea fish eat each other?" "Pretty sure most things eat each other somewhere. But, like, their own kind. That happens too." Caleb considered this. "That's messed up." "Yeah," Mason said. "It is." He drove a screw home and moved to the next one. The following week, Victoria called. Not texted, called, which he'd already learned was her preference. Victoria Hale sent texts that were functional. Addresses, times, specifications. When she wanted to actually communicate something, she called, and the calls were direct and without filler, which he respected without being able to say exactly why. "I have a client dinner on Thursday," she said. "Interior design, new client. They want to discuss a full residential commission for a house in the Hill District. They saw the bookshelf I posted on the firm's page." "The one I just built?" "Yes. They want to know if I have a furniture fabricator who can handle custom work for the whole project. 12 rooms if it goes forward." A beat. I told them I did. Mason sat back in his workshop chair. 12 rooms was more than a commission. 12 rooms was a partnership, effectively. 6 to 8 months of work, possibly more. The kind of thing that would reshape his schedule and his income in ways he'd need to think about carefully. What kind of house? He asked. Modern craftsman. The clients want original materials, custom work throughout. They're opposed to anything manufactured or prefabricated. She paused. You'd be interested in the work. I'm reasonably sure of that. What makes you reasonably sure? Because when I described the project to you just now, your voice changed. He opened his mouth and then closed it again because she was right, and he wasn't going to pretend she wasn't. The dinner's at 8, she said. The clients are a couple, early 50s. She's an engineer, he's a retired architect. You'll want to know that last part. Retired architect, Mason repeated, so he'll have opinions about the work. Constant opinions, which is either going to make this easier or much harder, depending on whether he likes you. How do I make sure he likes me? Don't simplify what you do to make it sound accessible. He spent 40 years in the industry. He'll know. He thought about that. You're good at this, he said. At what? Telling people what they need to know without being asked. A brief silence. Not uncomfortable. The kind of silence Victoria used sometimes like punctuation. A way of acknowledging something without commenting on it directly. Thursday at 8, she said. I'll send you the restaurant. She sent it 20 minutes later. A place in the Weston district he'd heard of but never been to. The kind of restaurant that didn't need to advertise because its clientele didn't require advertising to find it. He looked at the address for a while and then texted Darnell, his workshop assistant, to cover the Thursday afternoon jobs. He didn't examine the eagerness too closely. He'd gotten better at that. The dinner went well. The retired architect was named Gerald Foss, and he was exactly what Victoria had described. Opinions stacked on opinions. A man who had spent 4 decades being the most knowledgeable person in most rooms and hadn't quite recalibrated to retirement. He tested Mason within the first 10 minutes, asking technical questions framed as casual conversation, and Mason answered them without performing either confidence or deference, just said what he knew and admitted the one thing he was uncertain about, and watched Gerald Foss reevaluate him in real time. Gerald's wife, Patricia, the engineer, asked fewer questions and listened to more, and Mason got the sense that she was the one who actually made decisions. By the end of the meal, she had leaned across the table and asked Victoria directly, "Where has he been? Why haven't we heard of him?" "He keeps a small operation," Victoria said, "by choice." "Why?" Patricia asked Mason. "Because I'd rather build 10 things right than 30 things adequately," he said. Patricia looked at her husband. Gerald looked at Mason. Something passed between all 4 of them that wasn't quite an agreement yet, but was close enough to feel like the shape of one. On the sidewalk outside the restaurant afterward, in the cold November dark, Gerald and Patricia moved off toward their car, and Mason and Victoria stood briefly in the space left behind. Their breath was visible in the cold air. She had her coat on, a dark wool one that he noticed because it was the first time he'd seen her in something clearly chosen for appearance rather than utility, and it suited her in a way that made him aware of how rarely he thought about clothes, and how aware of them he was right now. "That went well," he'd said. It did. She was looking at him with something in her expression he hadn't seen before, something warmer than her usual careful attention. Not performed warmth, something that had come up on its own and she hadn't moved to contain it yet. "You knew it would," he said. "I thought it would. There's a difference." He laughed, just slightly, and she smiled at it, and they were standing close in the cold outside a restaurant, while the city moved around them, and neither of them moved to fill the silence or close the distance or do the obvious thing that the obvious thing pointed toward. "I should get back," she said eventually. "I have a 7 a.m. call with the permit office." "Still the North Shore thing?" "Still." A small compression of irritation around her mouth. "Apparently the structural approval requires an additional sign-off from a department that was created after we submitted the original paperwork. And the additional sign-off requires forms that weren't designed when we submitted, and..." She stopped herself. "You don't need to hear all of this." "I don't mind hearing it." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "That's different." He didn't ask different from what, though he thought it. He was pretty sure he knew the answer. They said goodnight, and he walked to his truck, and she walked to her car, and he didn't look back, which cost something, but he maintained it. He drove home thinking about 12 rooms and Gerald Foss and the way the cold air had made her cheekbones sharp and clear, and the way she'd said that's different with something careful and real underneath it. 3 days later, Sabrina texted again. "I know you're ignoring me. We have a son together. That means you don't get to just disappear. He stared at the message for a while. There was a specific kind of anger that Sabrina knew how to generate in him. Not hot anger, not the righteous, explosive kind that was at least honest, but a low, grinding resentment that worked on him like friction, wearing things down over time. The message was designed to do that. The framing of it, we have a son together, you don't get to disappear, positioned him as the abandoner, the irresponsible one, as though he was the parent who'd walked out of a marriage without looking back, rather than the one who'd spent 6 months trying to hold something together before finally accepting that there was nothing left to hold. He typed, "Caleb is fine. I'm fine. If you have concerns about Caleb, call." He sent it before he could revise it into something softer, which was what he usually did. Softened his communications with Sabrina because he'd learned that aggression cost him more than it cost her, and because Caleb didn't need his parents in active conflict. She didn't respond. He put the phone down and went back to work and didn't think about it again until Thursday of the following week, when Caleb came home from an afternoon at Sabrina's with a question that sat in Mason's stomach like cold metal. "Dad," Caleb said, dropping his backpack by the door the way he always did despite being told not to. "Is there a lady you go visit sometimes?" Mason was at the kitchen counter. He turned around carefully. "What do you mean?" "Mom said you've been going to some lady's house." Caleb had the expression of a child navigating information he'd been given by adults who were using him to navigate other adults. A look that was both confused and weirdly knowing, because 8-year-olds absorbed more than people gave them credit for. "Is that true?" "I've been working on a project," Mason said. "For a client. She's a client." He kept his voice even. "Why?" "Mom seemed upset about it." "Mom doesn't need to be upset about it. It's work." Caleb picked up his backpack automatically, without being reminded, which told Mason he was distracted. He stood there for a moment, turning a strap in his hands. "Is she nice?" he asked. "The lady." Mason looked at his son. "Yeah," he said. "She's nice." "Okay." Caleb seemed to do some internal arithmetic with this and arrive at a conclusion that satisfied him. "What's for dinner?" "Whatever you want that I have ingredients for." "Grilled cheese." "I have ingredients for grilled cheese." Caleb dropped the backpack again, without noticing, and disappeared toward the living room. Mason turned back to the counter and stood there for a moment with his hands flat on the surface, and thought about what Sabrina had said to their son, and felt the low grinding friction starting up again, and breathed through it. He texted Victoria that night. Not about Sabrina, just the Foss project. "I've been thinking about the material sourcing. Can I send you some notes before we meet with them on Friday?" She responded in 4 minutes. "Yes. Also, are you all right?" He stared at that for longer than he meant to. "Fine," he wrote back. "Work stuff." "Okay," she wrote. Then a minute later, "You can tell me if it's not fine." He put the phone down and looked at the ceiling. Then he picked it back up. "I know," he wrote. "That's different too." He could almost hear her pause before she answered. She sent a single word back, "Good." He fell asleep easier than he'd expected to. The Foss project was formally confirmed in the first week of December. 12 rooms, 18 months projected, materials budget that made Mason's stomach do something unfamiliar. He'd never worked at that scale before. Not the room count, but the intent behind it. The idea of an entire house being thought through together, design and fabrication in conversation from the beginning rather than the way it usually went, which was a designer handing off finished drawings and a fabricator building to spec without input. Victoria ran it differently than that. She scheduled joint meetings, herself and Mason, and Patricia Foss, who was the practical driver of the project, while Gerald provided opinions from a comfortable chair. They looked at material samples together. Victoria would propose a design intention, and Mason would respond with the physical reality of how to execute it, and the back and forth between them there was a word for it, though it took him a while to find it. Efficient wasn't quite right. Natural was closer. They thought in different vocabularies, but about compatible things, and the translation between those vocabularies stopped requiring effort somewhere around the third meeting. Patricia Foss noticed. One afternoon she looked between the two of them and said very dryly, "How long have you two been working together?" "About 6 weeks," Victoria said. Patricia raised an eyebrow and went back to the material samples, but something in the corner of her mouth said she didn't entirely believe the 6 weeks framing captured the full picture. Mason didn't say anything. He looked at the wood sample in his hand, a quarter-sawn white oak that would work beautifully for the main staircase, and thought about framing and what it did and didn't capture. It was around this time, the project confirmed, the professional partnership real and functioning, the personal thing between them circling closer to whatever it actually was, that Sabrina found out about Victoria Hale specifically. Not just some lady. Victoria, by name, by company, by approximate net worth as reported in a brief profile in a regional business magazine that someone had helpfully forwarded. Mason didn't know she knew until he came into his workshop one Tuesday morning to find Sabrina sitting on the hood of his truck in the parking lot. She was 31, Sabrina, and she still looked the way she'd looked when he'd met her at 26, sharply pretty. The kind of pretty that communicated awareness of itself, dark hair cut close on one side and longer on the other in a way that had been fashionable 3 years ago. She was wearing a jacket that was too thin for December and she was smoking, which she'd given up, supposedly. And she looked at him getting out of his car with the particular combination of studied indifference and total alertness that he recognized as her working stance. "You changed your locks," she said. "Yes." "Nice." She took a drag. "That's very direct of you." He stopped about 6 feet from his truck, which meant 6 feet from her. He kept his voice level. "What do you want, Sabrina?" "I want to talk to you." She held the cigarette away from her face. "That's all. Talk." "You sent my son home with questions he shouldn't be carrying. That's not talk. That's an opening move." Something shifted in her expression, a flicker of something that might have been guilt on someone who felt guilt more readily. "I didn't mean..." "You did mean it." He wasn't angry, which surprised him as he said it. He was tired in a different way than usual. Not the bone-deep tired of overwork, but the particular weariness of predictability, of seeing a pattern play out for the 100th time and not being surprised by it. "What do you actually want?" She looked at him for a long moment. The cigarette burned down between her fingers. "Her name is Victoria Hale," she said. "I looked her up. She's a CEO. She's got money, she's got some business profile, She stopped. Her jaw worked. "When did you meet her?" "That's not information you're owed." "I'm the mother of your kid." "Which means you're owed transparency about Caleb, not about my life." "Your life affects Caleb." "Sabrina." He waited until she actually looked at him. "We've had this conversation. We've had every version of this conversation. I'm not doing it again." "You don't even know her." She said it too quickly, the edge in it sharp enough to reveal what was underneath. She's successful and she's rich and she probably seems very composed and put together, but you don't know her, Mason. You know 6 weeks of her. You know her best behavior." "I knew 3 years of you," he said quietly. "I knew every version of you. I'm not comparing her to you. I'm telling you that who I spend my time with is my decision." Her face changed. He watched it. Watched the working surface of it cycle through several things before settling into something harder and more fixed. The expression she used when she'd decided the conversation was going in a direction she hadn't planned for. "She's going to get bored," Sabrina said. "Women like that, they try something different. They come down to our level, they play it normal for a while, and then they go back." She flicked the cigarette ash onto his parking lot. "I'm saving you 6 months of thinking it's real." He looked at her for a moment. The wind came through the lot and moved her hair across her face, and she didn't fix it. "You know what I used to think was wrong with me?" he said. "I used to think I didn't know how to love people. You told me that. You said my version of love was just maintenance, just showing up and fixing things." He paused. "I believed that for a long time. Mason, I don't believe it anymore." He moved past her to the workshop door, got his keys out. "I'm going to work now. Don't come back here without calling first." "And if I call, I'll decide then." He unlocked the door. "Caleb is fine. He's doing well in school. His teacher says he's reading above grade level." He glanced back at her. "That's the update. That's what you actually want to know, even if it's not what you came here to ask." He went inside and locked the door behind him and stood in the dark of the workshop for a minute before turning the lights on. The half-finished cherry chest sat in the corner where it always was. The morning came in through the clerestory windows the way it always did. Things were where he'd left them. He stood there and breathed until the grinding friction settled, and then he turned on the lights and went to work. He didn't tell Victoria about the parking lot conversation, not because he was hiding it. He turned this over and examined it to make sure, but because there was nothing she needed to do with the information. It was his situation to navigate, and it wasn't fair to drop it on her as though she were responsible for managing it. She had enough of her own weight. He knew more about that weight by now. Over the weeks of working together, of coffee and site visits, and the occasional dinner that wasn't a client dinner, but just dinner, she'd told him things the way she told him everything. Without excess, in pieces, only when she thought the information was relevant to something. He'd assembled a picture from those pieces the way he assembled furniture, each joint fitting the next. Her father had built Hale Design Group from a one-person operation. He'd died of a sudden cardiac event when Victoria was 24 and in her second year of working for him, which had left her simultaneously inheriting the company and grieving the man, with no clean way to do either. She'd spent 6 years building it into what it was now. 50 employees, regional recognition, the Hill District project, the largest commission they'd ever taken. She'd done it largely alone, in the sense that matters, which was not the absence of employees or partners, but the absence of someone to carry it with. "Did you have," Mason started one evening in her kitchen and then stopped. "Someone?" She was slicing an apple, not looking at him. "Yes, for a while, 2 years roughly." She set the knife down and turned the apple half over in her hands. "He was very supportive of my ambitions in theory. In practice, he found it difficult when my work required more of me than he'd anticipated." A short silence. "He said I'd built a wall. I said I'd built a company. We both thought the other person didn't understand the difference." "Did he?" She thought about it seriously, which he'd come to expect. She didn't give quick answers to things that deserved slow ones. "Partially," she said. "There probably was a wall. The company and the wall got built at the same time because of the same thing. It's hard to separate them after a while." He thought about that. "My ex-wife said I didn't know how to love people," he said. He hadn't planned to say it. It came out because the conversation had weight, and he was carrying some of that weight, and it needed somewhere to go. She said showing up and fixing things wasn't love. Victoria looked at him. "What do you think?" "I think she was telling me something about herself, not about me." He turned his coffee mug in his hands. "She needed things from people that I didn't know how to give. I'm not saying she was wrong to need them. I think I spent a long time believing her version of what I was. And it took longer than I'd like to admit to figure out the version was wrong." "What's the correct version?" He was quiet for a moment. "I think I'm a person who shows people they matter by being present, by fixing things, by building things, by showing up consistently and quietly without needing to be thanked for it." He paused. "Some people need that, and some people don't." She didn't. Victoria had gone very still in the way she did when something was landing. "Some people do," she said, quietly. The kitchen was warm. Outside, December had settled hard into Hartwell City, frost on the cars, breath in the air, the particular early darkness of the winter months. Inside there was coffee and the remains of sliced apple, and the drawings on the table and whatever was happening between them, which was currently happening very quietly and without any announcement, but was unmistakably happening. "Victoria," he said. "Don't," she said. Not unkindly. "Not yet." She looked at him, fully, directly, without the careful managed distance she usually maintained. "I want this to be right when it is. I don't want to rush it because it feels good right now and then have it be less right later." He understood that. He understood it in his bones, actually. The same instinct that made him work a joint 3 times before committing the final cut, because the final cut was permanent and impatience was a form of disrespect to the material. "Okay," he said. She nodded. She went back to the apple. He went back to his coffee. But something had been said, in the saying and the not saying of it. Something had been acknowledged. An acknowledgement, in Mason's experience, was the step that changed what came next. The week before Christmas, he brought Caleb to Victoria's house for the first time. It wasn't planned as a significant event. He'd come to drop off some hardware samples for the Foss project, and Caleb was with him because the school had a half day and the timing was what it was. He'd called ahead. Victoria had said, "Bring him. I'd like to meet him with the direct simplicity she used for everything. No performance of enthusiasm around it." And Mason had thought, okay. Caleb walked into her house and immediately looked at the bookshelf. He stood in front of it for a full minute, not saying anything, just looking, tracing the lines of it with his eyes, the way he'd started doing with furniture since Mason had brought him to the workshop. He reached out and touched one of the corner joints, the one Mason had fixed in the drawing on that first night. "You made this," Caleb said. "Yeah. The corners are different. Better joint. I changed the design." Caleb ran his finger along the joint, feeling the fit, and Mason watched him do it and felt something open and quiet in his chest. Victoria came in from the kitchen with 2 glasses of juice, one for Caleb without being asked, and crouched down to his level, which she didn't do in a theatrical way but in a practical one, because she was talking to someone shorter than herself, and she didn't want him looking up at her. "You're Caleb," she said. "Yeah." He looked at her with the frank assessment of an 8-year-old. "You're Victoria." "That's right." "My dad said you're nice." "I try to be." Caleb seemed to weigh this. "What's the child drawing?" he asked, pointing at the framed drawing near the kitchen entrance. Victoria looked at it. Something passed across her face. Brief, contained. "My niece made that. She's 4. She was very proud of it." "It's a horse," Caleb said confidently. "She says it's a house." Caleb looked at it again. "I think she meant horse." A sound came out of Victoria then that Mason had not heard before. Not quite a laugh. Something lighter than a laugh and less controlled. The kind of sound that happened when something caught you unprepared. She put her hand over her mouth for half a second, then lowered it, and the smile underneath it was different from any he'd seen on her, less contained, more actual. "You might be right," she said. Caleb nodded with the satisfaction of a small person who had been taken seriously. Mason stood in the living room doorway with his hardware samples and watched his son and Victoria Hale look at a 4-year-old's drawing of possibly a horse and felt something shift in him. Not dramatically. More like the way a house settles. A creak, a release of tension, a small movement toward the configuration it was always going to end up in. He drove home that evening with Caleb in the passenger seat, listing everything he had observed about Victoria's house, which included the bookshelf, the best one you've made, probably. The juice, it had something in it. Was it ginger? And Victoria herself. "She's really tall, Dad. Did you notice that?" "I noticed," Mason said. "She looks at people like she's actually listening, not just waiting to talk." Mason glanced over at his son, 8 years old. "Yeah," he said. "She does. I like that." Caleb looked out the window at the city going past. "A lot of people just wait to talk." Mason drove and didn't say anything. The city was lit up for the holidays, the strings of lights running along the commercial streets, catching the frost on the car windows and breaking into small, cold stars. Caleb fell asleep before they got home, which he still did sometimes in the car, and Mason sat at a red light and looked at his son's face in the rearview mirror, the impossible, ordinary miracle of it, and thought about walls and companies and what got built at the same time and how long it took to tell them apart. The light turned green. He drove them home. It snowed for the first time that winter the following week, on a Friday night when Mason was working late in the workshop finishing a small side table for a client pickup the next morning. He noticed it through the clerestory windows. The specific quality of light that snow at night produced, the way it made the dark above the city go orange and reflective. His phone buzzed on the workbench. Victoria. A text, which meant functional, not communicative. He reached for it. It wasn't functional. "It's snowing," she had written. "I know that's not information. I just wanted to tell you." He stood with the phone in his hand and the hand plane in the other and the snow coming down outside the high windows and felt something. Not a word for it. Not a tidy feeling he could label and set aside. Something that took up space in him and had no intention of vacating. He wrote back, "I can see it from the workshop." She wrote, "Good." Then, a minute later, "Go home, Mason. The roads will be bad." He set the phone down. He looked at the side table. One more pass, really. Just one. The surface wasn't quite right yet. He looked at the snow through the window. He put the hand plane down, got his jacket, and locked up the workshop. He drove home in the snow carefully, thinking about nothing in particular and everything at once. Sabrina's voice in his memory, she'll get bored, women like that. She'll go back. Smaller than it had been, quieter, the way things got when you stopped feeding them. He pulled into his parking lot and sat in the truck for a minute. The snow was coming down straight and steady, the kind that stuck. He thought about Victoria in her kitchen that first morning, making eggs without ceremony. He thought about her crouching down to talk to Caleb about a 4-year-old's drawing of possibly a horse. He thought about "that's different" and "not yet," and the way she smiled when something caught her unprepared, the smile that was less contained and more actual. He thought about the cherry chest in the corner of the workshop, 8 months in, 4 months still to go, built for no one but itself. He thought about what it meant to build something with no deadline and no commission, just because you needed to know you still could. He got out of the truck. The snow was cold and quiet under his boots. He went inside. He did not think about Sabrina's voice again that night. January came in cold and mean, the way Hartwell winters sometimes did. Not the gentle snowfall of December, but an actual grinding cold that got into the gaps of things, under doors and through window seals and into the joints of the city's older buildings. Mason's workshop ran 2 space heaters, and he still wore his coat inside until 10 in the morning. Caleb had developed a philosophy about January that involved as many layers as possible, and Mason had stopped arguing about it. The kid wore a fleece under his jacket to school, and if the other kids thought it was strange, Caleb had apparently decided that was their problem. The Foss project was in full motion. Mason had converted the back third of his workshop into a dedicated space for it. Lumber stacked and acclimating, drawings pinned to the wide corkboard he had hung on the east wall, a material log he updated every time something arrived or was ordered. It was the most organized he'd ever been about a job, which was partly because the scale required it, and partly because he knew Victoria would be in the workshop twice a week to check progress. And there was something about her particular quality of attention that made him want the work to be exactly right. She came on Tuesdays and Thursdays, usually in the late morning. She'd look at whatever was in progress, ask precise questions, occasionally make a small adjustment to the specifications after consulting the Foss drawing she kept in a folder she always brought. She never hovered. She looked, she asked, she noted, she left. It was professional in structure and something else in texture, and both of them were aware of the something else without doing anything obvious about it. Darnell, Mason's workshop assistant, was a 38-year-old man who had been working with Mason for 4 years and who possessed the specific kind of perception that came from spending a lot of time watching a person operate without them realizing they were being watched. One Thursday morning, after Victoria had left following a 40-minute visit, Darnell set down the piece he was hand-finishing and said, without preamble, "You know she's interested in you. She's a client. She's also interested in you. Both things are true at the same time, Mason. That's how reality works. We're in the middle of a major project together. And before the project, you went to dinner alone a couple of times. And she comes here twice a week and stays 40 minutes when the check-in should take 15. Darnell picked up his sandpaper again. "I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you what I see. I know what you see." "Then why are you talking about it like it's a problem?" Mason was quiet for a moment, turning a piece of oak doweling in his hands. "Because the last time I thought something was real, it wasn't," he said, "and it cost me a lot." Darnell looked at him steadily. He had the patient face of a man who knew when to let a sentence sit. "That was her," he said. "This is different. You've met Victoria twice. I've got eyes. Different is different." He went back to sanding. "Just saying." Mason set the doweling down and went back to work and didn't bring it up again. But he held the thought the way he sometimes held a piece of wood to feel the weight of it, turning it over, testing the grain. It was the last week of January when things with Sabrina changed register. She'd been quiet since the parking lot conversation, not absent, because Sabrina was never entirely absent, but operating at a distance that felt to Mason like the calm before a weather system. He'd learned over 3 years of marriage and 14 months of separation that Sabrina's silences were not neutral. They were preparatory. She was a person who needed momentum, who needed to be in motion, and stillness in her was always temporary and always pointed at something. What she was pointed at became clear on a Wednesday afternoon when Mason was between jobs, doing paperwork at the workshop desk, and his phone rang with a number he recognized as belonging to a woman named Carla, who had been Sabrina's best friend since high school, and who, to her credit, had always been reasonably decent to Mason even during the worst of the divorce proceedings. "Hey, Mason." Carla's voice had the quality of someone who had rehearsed what they were going to say and was now slightly uncertain about it. "I know this is weird, me calling. It's okay, what's up?" A pause. "I wanted you to know that Sabrina she's been in a bad place lately. I don't say that to excuse anything. I say it because I think something might happen and I want you to be ready." "Something like what?" "She found out more about the woman you're seeing, The CEO. Carla's voice dropped slightly. She's been drinking more than usual. She's been talking about... She stopped. She showed up at a bar with some of the old group last week and spent 2 hours talking about how this woman was going to take you away from Caleb, like financially. Like she was going to use her resources to... Mason, it doesn't make sense, I know. I told her that. But when Sabrina gets an idea in her head, she runs with it, he said. Yeah. He sat with this for a moment. I appreciate you calling, Carla. I know it's not my place. No, I mean it. Thank you. He paused. Does she know where Victoria lives? A beat that told him everything. She might, Carla said carefully. She's resourceful when she wants to be. He said goodbye and sat at his desk with the phone face down on the paperwork and thought about the shape of what was coming. Not if. When. Sabrina, in a bad place with a specific target and the particular combination of wounded pride and bad decisions that had defined the most painful chapters of their shared history. He called Victoria. She answered on the second ring. He could hear the background of her office, the low hum of a working space, someone's voice at a distance. I need to tell you something, he said. Okay. My ex-wife, I think she might... He stopped. He tried again. She's been making noise about us. Nothing specific yet, but I have it on good authority she's building towards something. I wanted you to know before it happened so it wasn't a surprise. A pause. He couldn't read the pause. How do you know? A mutual contact called me. She's been drinking more. She's fixated. He rubbed his jaw. I'm sorry, this is... Mason. Her voice was even. You don't need to apologize for someone else's behavior. It affects you. Many things affect me. I don't hold people responsible for things outside their control. Another pause, shorter. Are you worried about Caleb? That landed exactly where she'd meant it to. That was what he was actually worried about. Not himself, not even Victoria, but the way Sabrina's behavioral patterns tended to ripple outward and catch in the current of whatever was closest to him. A little, he admitted, then keep him close and let the other thing be what it is. She said it simply, without drama. If she comes here, to the firm or to my house, I can handle myself, you know that. I do know that. Good. A beat. Come Thursday. We need to look at the oak samples for the Foss staircase, and I want your opinion on 2 things before I finalize. Okay. And Mason. Her voice shifted just slightly. Not soft, but warmer at the edges than her professional register. Thank you for telling me. Most people wouldn't. He drove to the workshop, unlocked the door, stood in the familiar smell of cut wood and linseed oil, and felt the particular kind of steadiness that came from doing the right thing even when it was uncomfortable. He hadn't known that telling her would feel like that. He'd expected relief, maybe, or the guilty lightness of a transferred weight. What he actually felt was more like alignment, like a joint cut correctly, everything flush and true. He went back to work. The thing about waiting for Sabrina was that it did something to ordinary time. The days between Carla's call and whatever was coming were normal days. Caleb, the workshop, Victoria on Tuesday and Thursday. A Friday dinner that ended with them standing again in front of her bookshelf, while Caleb's drawing of a horse that was maybe a house sat in his memory, and simultaneously charged with a low-frequency tension that Mason recognized from years of living with a person whose moods set the barometric pressure of every room. He hated that he still recognized the feeling, hated that Sabrina's orbit still generated that particular atmospheric condition in him, even from a distance. He said none of this to Victoria. Not because he was hiding it, but because articulating it required a vocabulary for things he was still partly inside, and he didn't trust himself yet to describe the shape of something he hadn't finished navigating. It happened on a Friday in early February. Mason was in his workshop, mid-morning, working on the first of the Foss staircase components, a newel post in white oak, hand-carved detail at the cap, the kind of work that required long, uninterrupted focus. He had his phone on the bench but wasn't looking at it. The radio was on, something low. Darnell was at the other end of the shop doing finish work on a cabinet. His phone rang. He ignored it. It rang again immediately after. He reached for it. Victoria. She's here, Victoria said. Her voice was level, but there was something underneath it. Not fear, not quite, but the particular quality of controlled alertness that people had when something required immediate management. Outside the house. She's been there for about 10 minutes. Mason was already reaching for his jacket. Is she? She's not violent, she's loud. A sound in the background. Raised voice, indistinct. She's been calling my name. She knows my name, Mason. She said, she's saying things. A breath. I'm not frightened. I want to be clear about that. But I thought you should know. I'm coming. You don't have to. Victoria. He was already at the workshop door. I'm coming. He drove to Carver Hill in 22 minutes, which was fast for mid-morning city traffic, and pulled down the private lane to find a scene that was smaller and uglier than he'd imagined, and exactly as ugly as he'd feared. Sabrina was standing on the sidewalk in front of the low stone wall, maybe 30 feet from Victoria's front door. She was in her coat, one hand braced on the wall, and she was not screaming exactly, but pitched loud enough that her voice carried all the way to the lane entrance. Two of the neighbors from the adjacent property were visible at their windows. A woman who lived across the lane had come out onto her porch and was watching with the expression of someone who had already decided to remember this. Victoria was standing in the open doorway. This was what hit Mason first, harder than Sabrina's voice or the neighbors or any of it. Victoria standing in her own doorway, composed, straight-backed, not coming down the steps and not retreating inside. Just standing there in the cold morning light in her work clothes, watching Sabrina with the unhurried attention she turned on everything, and not giving an inch. Sabrina's words sharpened as he got out of his truck. Doesn't belong in your world and you know it. You picked him up because he was convenient, because he was a project, because you wanted something different for 5 minutes. But you will get bored. You will get bored and you will walk away. And he will be standing there having believed you. Sabrina. Mason's voice came out flat and carrying. He walked across the gravel toward her, not hurrying, not stopping either. That's enough. She turned. Her face was... He took it in quickly, the professional assessment of a person who had learned to read her. She'd been drinking, not currently, but recently enough for it to be in her posture, in the slightly too deliberate way she was standing. Her eyes were red-rimmed, which could have been cold or could have been crying. Probably both. You came, she said. So you're watching over her. I came because you're standing in front of someone's house making a scene. He stopped about 4 feet from her. And because the neighbors are watching and you're embarrassing yourself, and I don't want Caleb to hear about this. Her face flinched at Caleb's name. It always did. That wasn't manipulation on his part. It was the true center of what mattered. She's wrong for you, Sabrina said, lower now, not performing for the window watchers anymore. I'm not saying this because I want you back, Mason. I'm saying it because she is wrong for you, and you're building a whole thing in your head. How do you know what's in my head? Because I know you. I know how you get when you start building. That's what you do. You start building towards something, and you stop seeing what's actually there. What you actually see, he said, is that I'm doing okay, and that's the thing you can't stand. She went still. He hadn't meant to say it exactly like that. It wasn't calculated. It was just true. And he'd stopped catching true things before they came out. I'm not your villain, she said. Her voice had gone quieter. Something in it that was almost hurt, and maybe actually was. I'm not standing here because I'm the villain. I know you're not. He exhaled. The cold made his breath visible between them. Sabrina, I know you're not. But this... He gestured at the space between them, at the lane, at the open doorway where Victoria stood watching. This isn't you fighting for anything real. This is you not knowing what to do with a feeling and making it everyone else's problem. She looked at him for a long moment. Her jaw was working. Her eyes were doing the thing where they went very bright right before she cried, which he also still recognized, which also still cost him something, because whatever else she was the mother of his child, and he wasn't a person who could feel nothing about that. You always did that, she said finally. Said the real thing, the thing that you weren't supposed to say. She pulled her coat tighter. I hated that about you. I know. I also, she stopped herself. Never mind. She looked past him, up the lane, toward where Victoria was still standing in the doorway. Her expression when she looked at Victoria was complicated in ways Mason didn't have the right to try to decode. Then she looked back at him. Tell Caleb I'll call him Sunday. She turned and walked back toward the main road. He watched her go. Didn't say anything else. There was nothing else to say. When she turned the corner out of sight, he stood in the cold for a moment, the frost-stiff gravel under his boots. The bare oaks overhead, a neighbor's window closing across the lane. Then he turned and walked to the house. Victoria stepped back from the doorway to let him in. She closed the door behind them. The warmth of the house closed around them both. She walked toward the kitchen and he followed, and she put the kettle on, which gave them both something to do with their hands. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes." She put 2 mugs on the counter. "She was in pain," she said without looking at him. "Whatever else she was in pain." He looked at the back of her head, at the way she stood. "You watched all of that, and that's your first observation. I've watched enough of people to know what pain looks like when it performs." She turned around. She looked tired, he realized. Not dramatically, just the worn-in kind that came from managing something you hadn't asked to manage. It doesn't make what she said acceptable. It makes it comprehensible. "She said things about you. I heard them." She held his gaze. "I'm not fragile, Mason. She called me a project, said you didn't belong in my world, said I'd get bored and leave." A pause. "None of that is new information. I've thought about all of those things myself." He went still. "Which ones?" She was quiet for a moment, and the silence had weight. "The world one," she said finally. "I've thought about whether what I have is—" She turned back to the counter when the kettle began. "Whether the difference in what we have makes this harder than it needs to be. Whether I'm asking you to navigate things that aren't fair to put in front of you." She poured water into both mugs, steady-handed, precise. "I think about it." And I think it's a real thing to think about. I don't think it answers itself." He crossed the kitchen in about 4 steps and stood next to her at the counter. She handed him his mug. He took it and set it down immediately, which she noticed. "Victoria," he said. She turned to face him. They were close enough that he could see the tiredness in her face clearly, and the steadiness underneath it, and the things she'd been holding at a careful distance for 3 months. "The first morning I was here," he said, "you made eggs without asking me if I wanted them. You just knew I should eat and made eggs." He kept his voice even, not performing anything. "The day Caleb touched that corner joint and I could see him understanding the structure of it, you noticed. You didn't say anything. You just watched him, and you got it." He paused. Again. "You saw me give Sabrina information she hadn't asked for, that Caleb was reading above grade level, and you didn't ask why I did that. You just understood that I was still trying to give her something real inside a bad situation." She was watching him, very still. "I'm not a project," he said, "and you're not someone who's going to get bored. I know the difference between a person who's interested in what I can be and a person who's interested in what I am." He picked up his mug. "I'm telling you, I know the difference." She looked at him for a long time. Outside, a car went past on Carver Hill Road, close enough to hear briefly through the walls. "Okay," she said, quietly, without excess. "Okay," he said back. She picked up her mug. They stood next to each other at her kitchen counter and drank their tea, and neither of them said anything more about it, and it was exactly enough. What had happened that morning didn't stay contained. Mason had expected it to, had hoped, realistically, for a 24-hour news cycle on the lane, a few raised eyebrows, and then the quiet of things moving past. What he hadn't accounted for was one of the window-watching neighbors knowing someone who knew someone connected loosely to the industry Victoria operated in. Hartwell City was large enough to seem anonymous and small enough that information still moved the way it moved in smaller places, laterally, through existing relationships, at speeds that felt unreasonable. By Monday there was a thing, not a big thing, not a public thing, but within the specific social and professional circle that Victoria Hale occupied, the circle of firm owners and developers and city commissioners and clients who attended the same quarterly events and saw each other at the same gallery openings, there was a story in circulation. The broad strokes of it, as Mason pieced together from what Victoria told him with characteristic understatement, were roughly accurate. Victoria Hale's furniture contractor had an unstable ex-wife who'd shown up at her property and made a scene. "How bad?" he asked when she called him Monday evening. "It's not bad," she said. "It's noise. I've had noise before. This is different noise. This is personal noise. I run a company, Mason. I've had noise about my age, my gender, my qualifications, a vendor who sued me in small claims for reasons that didn't survive 10 minutes in front of a judge. This is not the worst noise. That doesn't mean it shouldn't bother you. It bothers me that it happened at my house, she said. It bothers me because it was my house and it was intended to humiliate me in front of my neighbors. I'm not going to pretend that's nothing. A pause. But it doesn't change anything about what I think. Some people are going to pull back professionally. Some people will. Her voice was steady. The ones who do aren't people I want building long-term relationships with anyway. That's easy to say. No, she said, with a slight sharpening in her voice that he'd learned meant she was saying something she'd thought about seriously and wasn't going to walk back. It isn't easy. I've spent 12 years building a professional reputation, and I know exactly what it costs when things like this enter the story. I'm not being breezy about it. I'm telling you what I've decided. He was quiet. Mason, her voice evened back out. I didn't build what I built by walking away from things that mattered because someone made noise about them. He exhaled. Long, slow. Okay. Are you all right? She asked. The same question he'd asked her standing in her kitchen 2 days ago. I'm working on it, he said honestly. I keep thinking about Caleb, whether this follows him somehow. Children are more resilient than the adults protecting them usually are. My mother used to say that. She sounds smart. She'd like you, he said, before he could stop himself. A brief silence. Then Victoria said, I'd like to meet her sometime. He smiled, though she couldn't see it. I'll make it happen. Good. He could hear her moving in her office, the soft close of a drawer. Get some sleep. You have a newel post to finish. I know I have a newel post to finish. Good night, Mason. Good night, Victoria. He sat on his couch after the call, phone in his lap, the apartment quiet around him. Caleb was asleep. The heat was doing something in the baseboard heaters that sounded like percussion. He could hear faintly the traffic on the main road 2 blocks east. He thought about Sabrina, not with anger, with something more tired and more complicated. He thought about the woman she'd been at 26, the way she could walk into a room and make it rearrange around her, the specific electricity of those first 2 years when they'd both believed they were building something. He thought about the way that electricity had started to feel like a warning sign rather than a feature, the way every surge of it was followed by a drain that left him more hollowed out than before. He'd loved her. That was still true, and it wasn't something he was going to revise. He'd loved her in the incomplete, insufficient way that 2 young people loved each other when they mistook intensity for depth. That kind of love had a shelf life. When it expired, what was left wasn't enough for either of them, and they'd both suffered the consequences of refusing to see that clearly for too long. The thing he kept coming back to. The thing he'd said to her face on that February morning that had been true in a way he hadn't fully understood until he heard himself say it, was the control. She had loved controlling him. Not maliciously, maybe. Not with premeditation. But there was something in Sabrina that had needed to define the terms of his world, what he worked on, who he spent time with, how much of his attention she held at any given moment. And he had let her, because he'd confused accommodation for love, and because he'd been young, and because she was electric and he'd wanted to be near the electricity even when it burned. The parking lot. The words he'd finally said, "You never truly loved me. You loved controlling me." He'd thought about those words a lot since, turned them over and looked at them from different angles the way he turned wood in his hands. They were true, but they were incomplete. The more complete version was something like, "You loved me the way you understood love. And the way you understood love was about possession. And I taught you that was okay for a long time because I didn't know it wasn't." He would not let his son learn that. He thought about Caleb touching the corner joint on the bookshelf, the careful, wondering quality of it, the trying to understand. He thought about what he wanted Caleb to know about the difference between a relationship that electrified and a relationship that held, between something that felt important and something that actually was. He got up, turned off the kitchen light, checked the front door lock out of habit. He went to bed. He lay in the dark and didn't immediately fall asleep, which was normal. What wasn't normal was what happened in the space before sleep, the absence of the grinding friction he'd carried for months. Sabrina's voice in his memory, smaller again. The specific fear he'd maintained, that peace was boring, that the absence of drama meant the absence of something real, quieter than it had been even last week. He thought about Snow texted without context. "I know that's not information. I just wanted to tell you." He thought about that's different and not yet, and eggs made without being asked for. The thing about peace was that he'd always experienced it as lack. The absence of conflict, the quiet left behind when the noise stopped. A negative space. He'd been waiting for peace to feel like something positive, like joy, like excitement, like the charged atmosphere of something about to happen. He hadn't expected it to feel like this, like a chest built with hand-cut dovetails and no deadline. Like someone watching his son understand the structure of a joint and not saying anything because the moment didn't need words. Like a woman in a doorway who had walked into the rain to knock on a stranger's window and offer coffee. He fell asleep on that. Outside, February sat over Hartwell City in its usual graceless way. Too cold for comfort, not cold enough for beauty. The month that everyone agreed was just something to be gotten through. But in Mason's two-bedroom apartment on the east side, something was settling the way things settled when they'd found the right configuration. Not finished, not perfect, but oriented correctly, which was the necessary first condition for anything worth building. The cherry chest in the workshop still had 4 months of work left in it. The Foss project was 6 months into an 18-month arc. Caleb was still 7, going on 8, going on something Mason couldn't fully see yet. Victoria Hale was still exactly as complicated and precise and real as she'd been on the morning she made eggs without being asked, and the something between them had not yet found its final shape. But the door was open, and he had stopped waiting for someone to close it. March came in the way it always did in Hartwell. Indecisive, running cold 1 week and offering something almost warm the next, as though the season couldn't commit. The oaks along Victoria's Lane had started showing the first faint suggestion of buds. Not green yet, but swollen in a way that meant green was coming, and Mason noticed them every time he pulled down the lane because he'd started paying attention to small things again. That was something he recognized in himself as a change, though he couldn't have said exactly when it happened. At some point in the preceding months, he'd stopped moving through the world with his head down and started looking at things again. The oaks, the specific quality of light in the workshop at 4 in the afternoon, the way Caleb's hands had started to look less like a small child's and more like a person's. Longer fingers, more deliberate movement, things he'd been too tired or too defended to notice for a while. The Foss project was at the stage where the individual pieces had been built and delivered and were beginning to inhabit the house. Mason had started spending time at the Hill District property 2 or 3 times a week, installing, adjusting, doing the on-site finish work that couldn't be done in the workshop. The house itself was a good house, the kind that had been designed with actual thought behind it, and watching it come together gave him the particular satisfaction of seeing a long project reveal itself. Gerald Foss was frequently on site, which had initially concerned Mason and had gradually become something he almost looked forward to. The man had 40 years of opinion, and most of it was worth something, even when it was delivered in the unnecessarily authoritative way of someone who'd been the smartest person in most rooms for too long. Gerald had a habit of standing next to whatever piece Mason was installing and saying things like, "The Romans used dowels, you know," or "mortise and tenon is essentially just a refinement of a much older principle." And Mason had learned to receive these observations the way you received weather. Acknowledge it, work through it, don't fight it. One afternoon in mid-March, Gerald stood next to Mason while he fitted the last of the built-in cabinetry in the main study and said, without particular preamble, "You and Victoria." Mason kept his hands on the cabinet face, checking the alignment. "What about us? I've known Victoria Hale for 3 years. Done 2 projects with her. She's excellent at what she does." Gerald was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone choosing their next words carefully. "She doesn't look at people the way she looks at you. I want you to know that, in case you're not sure." Mason straightened up. He looked at the older man who was looking at the cabinetry with the expression of someone pretending to assess joinery while actually saying something else entirely. "I appreciate that," Mason said. "Patricia agrees." Gerald moved a step to the side to look at the corner detail. "Patricia is a better judge of people than I am. I have more opinions and fewer accurate ones." He touched the cabinet edge. "This is good work. It's solid work. Good and solid are the same thing when you're building something meant to last." He looked at Mason briefly. "That applies to more than cabinets." Mason didn't respond to that. He picked up his level and checked the horizontal. The cabinet was true. He texted Victoria that evening. "Gerald gave me what I think was a blessing today. Hard to say for sure. He framed it as a furniture observation. She responded in 3 minutes. That's how he does everything. Did he mention the Romans? Dowels. Classic. A pause, then, he's not wrong, whatever he said. Mason looked at his phone for a moment, then, I know. What had happened between them in her kitchen after the February morning, the thing that had been said in the saying and the not saying of it, had not resolved into anything with a label exactly. They hadn't sat down and defined it. That wasn't how either of them operated. What had happened instead was a gradual shift in the texture of everything, a small but consistent adjustment in how close they stood and how much was left unsaid, and what kind of silences were now comfortable between them. He kissed her for the first time on a Thursday evening in late March. It wasn't planned, which he suspected was the only way it could have happened, given that they were both people who overthought things they cared about. They were standing in her kitchen, looking at material samples for the Foss upstairs hallway, wood finishes fanned out across the table, swatches of fabric beside them, and she reached past him to pick up a sample in their hands crossed, and she didn't immediately move hers away. She looked up at him. He looked at her, and then he kissed her, briefly, without making a production of it, and she kissed him back the same way, present, deliberate, no performance attached. And when they separated, she looked at him with that quality of attention that had undone him from the beginning and said very quietly, "Okay. Good." "Okay," he agreed. "Good." She turned back to the samples and picked up the one she'd been reaching for originally. "This finish," she said, "is too warm for the hallway light. What do you think about the cooler gray?" "I think the cooler gray," he said. They went back to work, later, much later, when the samples were put away and the kitchen was quiet and the city had gone dark outside the windows. They sat on her couch with their coffee going cold on the table, and he told her things he hadn't told another person in 3 years. Not in a confessional rush, not the way grief poured out when the dam broke, but the way it came out when you trusted someone enough to tell the truth at a reasonable pace. He told her about the last year of his marriage, about the specific way Sabrina's cruelty had worked, not in large dramatic strokes, but in small accumulated erosions, the daily 1,000-cut method of making a person unsure of their own judgment, the way she'd use Caleb, not consciously maybe, but effectively, as a lever in arguments, the way Mason had spent years trying to fix things, the marriage, her moods, the dynamic between them, with the same problem-solving instinct he brought to furniture, and the way it had failed every time because a relationship wasn't a structural problem, and love wasn't engineering. The worst part is, he said, isn't the divorce. The divorce was, he thought about how to say it. The divorce was the right outcome. It was hard, and it cost me things, and I still grieve what I thought we were going to be, but the marriage was the wrong configuration. The worst part was the 2 years before the divorce where I kept thinking if I was better, more patient, more present, more whatever she needed, it would work. I put so much of myself into trying to be what the situation needed that I stopped knowing what I was when it wasn't needed. Victoria was quiet, listening in the way she listened, which was fully, without preparing her response while he was still talking. And then she left, he said, and I had Caleb in the workshop, and he turned his coffee mug in his hands. I built a version of life that was manageable, which is not the same as good, but manageable has a kind of integrity when good isn't available. Yes, Victoria said. It does. He looked at her. What's yours? She understood what he meant. She was quiet for a moment, not evasively, but genuinely thinking. Mine is simpler in structure and probably harder in practice, she said. I decided very early that the company was the thing that mattered, after my father died. I needed it to be the thing that mattered because grief needed somewhere to go, and the company needed someone to hold it, and both of those things were true at the same time. She turned her own mug in her hands, a mirror of him that she probably didn't notice. And it worked. The company grew. I got good at this. And I looked up one day and I was 30, and the company was successful, and the wall I'd built between me and everything else had done exactly what walls do, kept the bad things out and the good things too. The man you mentioned. He wasn't wrong that there was a wall, she said. He was wrong about what to do about it. He kept trying to get over it. What he should have done was wait for me to open a door. She looked at him. That's not a metaphor I planned. It's just what it was. When did you open one? He asked. She held his gaze. When someone knocked, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. I wasn't trying to knock anything. I was trying to drive away. I know. That's why it worked. He laughed. The real kind, not the polite kind. And she smiled at it, the less contained smile, the one that happened when something caught her unprepared. They sat there in her living room with the cold coffee and the late hour and the kind of quiet that had weight and warmth both. And Mason thought that if Sabrina could have seen this, not to gloat, not to prove a point, just to see, she would have had a hard time calling it maintenance. This was not maintenance. He didn't know the exact word for it yet, but it was something real, and it was something he was inside, and it was the most awake he'd felt in years. April brought more light, and the Foss project entered its final third, which was where every long project became a different animal. The large structural work was done. The built-ins, the staircase, the kitchen cabinetry, the library wall that Gerald Foss had spent 6 weeks developing opinions about, and which was, by any reasonable measure, the best thing Mason had ever built for a client. What remained was detail work. Smaller custom pieces for individual rooms, hardware finalization, the on-site adjustments that only revealed themselves once you could see how the large pieces lived in the actual space. It also meant Mason and Victoria were on-site together more often, which changed things in ways neither of them had fully accounted for. When they'd been working separately, him in the workshop, her at the firm, the professional and personal had maintained a comfortable lane separation. On-site at the Foss house, those lanes ran together. They made decisions jointly, sometimes in front of Patricia and Gerald, sometimes just between themselves, and the shorthand they'd developed over months of working together became visible in a way that hadn't been visible before. Patricia Foss watched this with the engineer's eye. She turned on everything. One afternoon, she caught Mason alone in the upstairs hallway and said, with no preamble whatsoever, "You're good for her." "I think she'd argue about who's good for whom," he said. "She'd be right. You're both good for each other. But you specifically, you see her without the company attached. Most people can't separate them." She looked at the hallway built-in he'd been adjusting. "Is this level?" "Half a degree off. I'm fixing it." "Good." She walked away, having said exactly what she came to say, and nothing more. He thought about that conversation for the rest of the afternoon. You see her without the company attached. He hadn't thought about it in those terms, but he understood it was accurate. Victoria Hale, the CEO, was a known entity in Hartwell City, visible, accomplished, the subject of professional profiles and event invitations, and the particular kind of regard that successful women of her age received, which was a mix of respect and skepticism in proportions that varied by who was looking. That version of her was real. He'd watched her operate as that version in client meetings and on-site decisions and the way she managed her team, and it was genuinely impressive. But he'd also watched her look at a 4-year-old's drawing of a horse that was maybe a house and lose her composure for half a second. He'd watched her make eggs at 8 in the morning for a man she'd known for 12 hours. He'd watched her stand in a doorway while someone screamed at her and not give a single inch, not out of coldness, but out of a kind of integrity that had nothing to do with status or reputation. He'd watched her be tired, once, actually tired, when the North Shore permit delay had compounded with 2 other project complications in the same week, and she'd shown up to a Tuesday workshop visit with less of her usual composure in place and said, very flatly, "I need to sit down for a minute," and sat on his workshop stool and said nothing for about 3 minutes while he made coffee. "Better?" he'd asked when she stood up. Marginally. She'd taken the coffee. "I don't do that often." "I know." "It's not weakness," she said, with a slight edge that told him she'd heard that implication from someone before, at some point, and hadn't forgotten it. "I know that too," he said. "It's just tired. Tired is just tired." She'd looked at him over the coffee mug. "Thank you," she said. "You don't have to thank me for making coffee." "I'm not," she said. He hadn't asked what she was thanking him for. He thought he knew. Caleb had started coming to the Foss house on some Saturdays. This had developed gradually, organically, through the specific logic of an 8-year-old who wanted to see where his father was going, and a father who saw no good reason to pretend it was somewhere his son couldn't follow. Victoria had been clear, early, that Caleb was welcome anywhere she was, not as a performance of being good with kids, but as a practical statement of preference. The first few Saturdays, Caleb had been on his best behavior in the specific way that children were on their best behavior when they were paying attention to everything. He'd watched Mason work, asked careful questions, helped with small tasks, and observed Victoria with the frank, ongoing assessment he'd been conducting since the first horse-drawing afternoon. He was forming opinions. Mason could see him forming them. The assessment shifted in April, on a Saturday when Victoria had come to the Foss property to check some installation details and stayed longer than she'd planned. She found Caleb in the unfinished garden room on the ground floor. French doors open to the side yard, the spring light coming in, the smell of fresh plaster and cut wood in the air, sitting in the middle of the floor with 3 pieces of wood scrap and a bottle of wood glue, attempting to build something. "What is that?" she asked. Caleb looked up. He held up the construction. "A chair," he said, "for a very small person." She crouched down, the same way she always did to his level, which he had definitely noticed and registered as a thing adults often didn't do. "The proportions are wrong," she said. "The back legs are different lengths." "I know." He looked at it critically. "I didn't have anything to measure with. I have a measuring tape." She took the small one she kept clipped to her jacket pocket. She always had one, and handed it to him. He looked at it, then at the chair, then back at her. "Can you help me fix it?" She sat down on the floor next to him, in her good work clothes, on a plaster-dusty floor, and helped him fix the chair. She didn't do it for him. She measured with him, showed him where the discrepancy was, talked him through what needed to change. Mason stood in the doorway and watched this for about 2 minutes before deciding it was not a moment that needed his participation. He went back to work. When he came back through the garden room 40 minutes later, the small chair was fixed, all 4 legs even, back appropriately proportioned, and Caleb was showing Victoria a knot in one of the scrap pieces with the serious tone of an expert. "That's called a burl," he said. "It grows where the tree was stressed. Dad says the grain is really complicated inside." "It is," Victoria said. "Furniture makers prize them." "Why would you want something from a stressed tree?" "Because the stress is what makes the grain interesting," she said. "Straight-grained wood is predictable. Burl wood is—" She paused, choosing. "It surprises you." Caleb turned the piece over in his hands. He looked at it with the expression he used when he was storing information for later use. "Like people," he said. Victoria looked at him. Something moved in her face. "Yeah," she said. "Like people." Mason watched Caleb set the wood piece down carefully, as though it now mattered more than it had before, and felt something in his chest open in a way that hurt a little and was also entirely welcome. May arrived and the project was 6 weeks from completion, and something else was completing itself alongside it, in the specific background way that the most important things always did. Mason had, by increments he could trace if he tried, become part of Victoria's daily life. Not formally. There were no conversations about what this was or where it was going, not yet, and he was still sleeping in his own apartment on the east side and she was still in her house on Carver Hill. But practically, he knew her morning routine. He knew she drank her first coffee black and her second with a small amount of cream. He knew she had a tendency to overcommit to projects in the planning phase and then navigate the overcommitment through sheer competent execution, which worked but cost her. He knew she had 2 modes in difficult client conversations, a very patient version that could sustain almost any provocation, and a final mode that emerged only after the patient version had been genuinely exhausted, at which point she became extraordinarily precise and quite frightening in a way that resolved situations very quickly. He knew she liked physical space, not emotional distance. She'd gotten much better at that. Or he'd gotten better at reading when she needed approach and when she needed room, but literal, physical space in a house. She moved through rooms with a quality that required clearance. She'd told him once, without context, that she'd grown up in a house that was too small for the number of people in it, and he'd filed that away as explanation for several things he'd already noticed. She knew him too by now. She knew that he worked through difficult things with his hands, that when he was processing something, he'd go to the workshop and build or repair something that didn't need repairing. She knew that he undercommunicated when he was ashamed of something and overcommunicated when he was trying to compensate for undercommunicating. She knew that his relationship with his mother was the clearest window into who he'd been before Sabrina got in and rearranged things. She knew that Caleb was the thing he was most proud of and most frightened for simultaneously, and that those 2 things were inseparable in him. She'd met his mother in April at Sunday dinner. His mother, Diane Reed, was a 61-year-old retired school administrator who wore her hair natural and her opinions plainly, and had the specific quality of warmth that came from a person who had worked with children their entire career. Genuine, unpatronizing, interested in the actual human in front of her rather than the story about them. She'd shaken Victoria's hand and looked at her for a moment and then said, "Mason said you were nice. He understates. He's careful with his words," Victoria said. "I appreciate that." "He learned it the hard way," Diane said, with the directness of a woman who didn't see the point of being indirect about true things. "Sit down. Dinner's almost ready." Mason had watched them during dinner with the anxious attention of a person who had not brought someone to Sunday dinner in years and was operating on instincts that may have been slightly outdated. He'd worried, in the week leading up to it, about the combination: his mother's directness and Victoria's composure, and the various ways those two qualities could either align or strike sparks. They aligned, better than he'd hoped. His mother asked about the company in the way she asked about everything. Not impressed asking, not trying to seem interested, but actually interested, following up on specifics. Asking what the hardest thing about running a 50-person firm was in the same tone she'd ask what the hardest thing about teaching third grade was. Victoria answered honestly, which Mason had noticed she always did when asked a question with genuine interest behind it. She said the hardest thing was managing the distance between the work itself, which she loved, which she'd built this life around, and the administrative weight of a business of that size. "I went to school to design things," she said. "A significant portion of my week now is managing people who design things. It's a good problem, but it's still a displacement." "Teaching is the same," Diane said immediately. "You become an administrator to have more impact, and then you're spending your days in budget meetings and hiring decisions, and you look up and realize the classroom is the thing you miss." She pointed her fork. "The thing you're best at always has something sitting between you and it." "Yes," Victoria said, "that's exactly it." Caleb, at the other end of the table, was eating a second piece of cornbread and pretending not to listen in the way he always pretended not to listen, which fooled no one and which Mason had decided to let go. After dinner, while Victoria and Caleb were in the living room looking at a picture book about woodworking techniques that Diane had given Caleb the previous Christmas, Diane found Mason in the kitchen drying dishes and stood next to him and said quietly, "She's good, Mason." "I know. I mean good the way you're good. Not the same, but the same orientation." She took a plate from the drying rack. "She's been let down a lot. I can see that. People who've been let down a lot carry it in a specific way. She carries it well. She does. So do you." His mother put the plate away. "I just want you to know that I see it. What you're building here, it's real." He looked at the window above the sink. The evening outside, the familiar back fence he'd helped his mother paint 3 summers ago. "I'm trying to be careful," he said. "Care is good." She took another plate. "But careful and afraid are different things. Don't let careful turn into afraid." He thought about that for the rest of the evening. The Foss project completed on a Thursday in late May. Patricia and Gerald did the walkthrough with Victoria and Mason together, which felt appropriate. 4 people who had spent 18 months thinking about a house now walking through it finished, the rooms holding the weight and intention that had gone into them. Gerald was quiet through most of it, which was unusual and therefore significant. He touched things as he walked: the library wall, the staircase newel post, the kitchen cabinet faces. He ran his hand along the hallway built in that had been half a degree off and was now true. At the end of the walkthrough, in the main living room with the late afternoon light coming through the large windows and landing on the hand-finished floors and the custom built-ins and all of it, Gerald Foss turned to Mason and extended his hand. "I've worked with a lot of craftsmen," he said. "This is exceptional work." Mason shook his hand. "Thank you." "I mean it. I have opinions about a lot of things, and most of them are worth less than I think they are. This one I'm confident about." Patricia, behind him, said dryly, "He's been working up to that since February." "I wanted to wait until I'd seen it finished," Gerald said, without turning around. Victoria was standing near the windows. She was looking at the room with the expression she used when she was doing the internal accounting. She always did at the end of a project, tallying what had been intended against what had been achieved, noting the gaps, acknowledging the places where the outcome had exceeded the plan. Mason watched her do it. He'd seen her do it after every Foss milestone, and had learned to read what was coming. First the accounting, then the brief private satisfaction she didn't advertise, then the immediate orientation toward whatever was next. This time, the accounting took longer. She stood there in the light for a minute, maybe more, and the satisfaction when it came was less brief than usual. She was looking at the room and at what they'd built together and at something he suspected was larger than the room. She glanced at him. He raised his eyebrows slightly. Well? She gave him a look that said several things at once, all of them good. They went to dinner that evening, just the two of them, at a place in the Meridian district that wasn't the kind of restaurant you needed money to navigate, but was good in the way places were good when they cared more about the food than the atmosphere. They sat across from each other in a corner booth and ordered and talked about everything except the project, which was finished now and had its own separate container in both their minds. "What's next?" she asked. "I have 3 smaller commissions backed up. A dining set, a bed frame, a desk." He turned his water glass. "And the cherry chest. I should actually finish the cherry chest." "How long has it been?" 13 months. She looked at him. "What's it for?" He'd answered this question before. Back in October, that first morning, he'd said, "I need to know I can still make something that isn't for anyone but itself." He still believed that. But sitting here now, across from Victoria Hale, the answer had acquired a second layer he hadn't anticipated. "I'll tell you when it's done," he said. She looked at him steadily, that quality of attention that still undid him a little even after 8 months of being its object. Then she nodded. "Okay, what's next for you?" 2 new commissions. A commercial space in the north side. Finally, after North Shore, I'm staying away from permit-heavy projects for at least 6 months. She sipped her water. "And I've been thinking about something else." "What?" "I want to do something that isn't for a client." She said it in the same way he'd said it 13 months ago, carefully, as though the idea was still fragile and needed careful handling. "The Foss project. Working with you. The way we worked. It reminded me that I went into this field because I wanted to design spaces for how people actually lived in them, not for magazine spreads or portfolio pieces, for the people inside." She looked at the table. "I've been so focused on building the company that I've been building for the company. I don't know yet. I want to design something that's just," she paused, "for itself," he said. She looked up. "Yes." They sat with that for a moment, the shared language of it. The recognition that they were orbiting the same thing from different disciplines. "I'd like to see it," he said, "whatever you design." "I'd like to show you," she said. They ate dinner and the conversation moved through other things. Caleb's end-of-year school event, Darnell's request for a raise which was overdue and which Mason was going to grant, a regional design award that Victoria's firm had been nominated for, and underneath it all, threaded through all of it, was the thing they'd built. Not the house. The other thing. The one that had started with a wrong number call in the rain and a woman walking off a porch into cold weather to knock on a stranger's window. He drove her home that evening. He walked her to the door, which he'd started doing, and she turned on the porch steps and looked at him in the light from the entry lamp. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it. The project, the work. You don't have to thank me. It was good work." "I know. I'm not thanking you for the work." She held his gaze. "I'm thanking you for—" She stopped, which was unusual because Victoria Hale almost always found the right word. "For being steady," she said finally. "When things were not steady, you were just steady." He looked at her. And this woman who had built 50 people's livelihoods and stood in a doorway while someone screamed at her and sat on a dusty floor, helping an 8-year-old measure chair legs, and stayed very still in her kitchen so she wouldn't say too much too soon. This woman with the wall and the door, she'd opened herself. "That's just who I am," he said. "I know," she said. "That's what I'm thanking you for." She went inside. He stood on the porch for a moment in the May night air, which was finally warm the way May night should be, and thought about steady and what it meant and whether Sabrina had been wrong about it. Not performance, it's just maintenance, Mason. It's not love. But the actual substance of showing up, of being there, of fixing what you could and staying through what you couldn't. He thought about what he'd built over the last 8 months. Not the Foss staircase, though that was exceptional work. Not the bookshelf, though it would hold for decades. The other thing, the thing that had no commission and no deadline and existed because he'd stopped driving away. He walked back to his truck. He drove home through the warm May night. He thought about the cherry chest. 13 months in, and what remained was maybe 6 weeks of work if he was honest about it. The dovetails were cut and fitted, the panels carved, the main structure complete. What was left was the inside work, the finishing of the interior surfaces, the fitting of the tray, the final details that most people never saw but that mattered to the maker more than anyone else. He'd been avoiding finishing it. He understood why now, and the way you understood things once the distance was right for seeing them. He'd built the chest as proof that he could still make something with no purpose other than its own existence. But somewhere in the last 8 months, without making a decision about it, the chest had acquired a purpose. Not a commissioned one, not a functional one, exactly. Something else. He thought about it the whole drive home. He parked in his lot and sat for a moment. Then he took out his phone and sent a text. "I know what the chest is for," he wrote. "Come see it when it's done." Victoria's response came while he was still sitting in the truck. 3 words, which was about right for what they meant. "I'll be there." The cherry chest was finished on a Saturday morning in the second week of June. Mason had known it was coming. The way you always knew when a long piece of work was approaching its end, not from a checklist, but from some interior sense of rightness that accumulated over the final stages. The last 6 weeks had been different from the 13 months preceding them. He'd worked on it every evening after Caleb went to bed, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for 3, moving through the interior, finishing with the same unhurried attention he'd given the exterior construction. The inside surfaces had taken a beeswax finish he'd applied by hand, 3 coats, each one rubbed in and buffed and left to cure. The fitted tray was white maple, hand-planed to a tolerance that made it sit in its channel without gap and without tightness. The specific satisfying middle ground that only handwork could achieve with wood that moved with humidity the way cherry did. The hardware was hand-forged iron he'd commissioned from a metalsmith in the Arts District, simple bale handles with a slightly rough surface that would smooth over years of use. He set the last piece of hardware and stepped back. The chest was about 30 inches tall and 48 wide, low and long and clearly made for the long haul. The cherry had darkened already from exposure to light. That was what cherry did, started pale and oxidized toward a deep reddish brown over years, a wood that improved with time in ways that most materials didn't. The hand-cut dovetails were visible at every corner. The precise interlocking of the tails and pins that any woodworker would recognize as real, and any non-woodworker would sense as intentional without knowing why. The carved panels on the front face were a design he'd worked out over months, a pattern that wasn't quite geometric and wasn't quite organic, something he'd arrived at through iteration rather than plan. He stood there in the Saturday morning light of his workshop and looked at it for a while. It was the best thing he'd ever made. He knew that without needing to qualify it or check it against a list of criteria. It was the kind of work that came from a person operating at the outer edge of their ability over a sustained period of time. And those 2 conditions, the edge and the sustained period, were both necessary. You couldn't rush to the edge and you couldn't stay there without time. 13 months was about right. He texted Victoria at 9:43. "It's done. Come when you can." She arrived at 11:15. He heard her car on the gravel parking lot. He'd given her the gate code 3 months ago. A small practical thing that had felt significant in the way small practical things sometimes did, and he was at his workbench when she came through the workshop door. She stopped. He watched her see it. She stood in the doorway and looked at the chest and went very still. In the particular way she went still when something was landing. He didn't say anything. He'd learned that Victoria needed a moment when she was absorbing something that mattered, and that talking into that moment was a way of taking it from her. She walked across the workshop. She stopped in front of the chest. She looked at it the way she looked at all good work. Not just the surface, but the structure behind the surface, following the decisions of the maker, tracing the logic. She reached out and touched one of the dovetail corners. Her finger ran along the joint, feeling the fit. "Mason," she said quietly. "Yeah, this is..." She stopped. She turned and looked at him. Her eyes were doing something he hadn't seen before. Not crying, not quite, but close to the edge of it. "This is exceptional." "I know." "The panels." She turned back, touched the carved front face. "Where did this pattern come from?" "I don't know exactly. I worked it out over about 4 months. It kept changing." He came to stand beside her. "The first version was too controlled. The second was too loose. It took a while to find the version that was..." "Both," she said. "Yeah." She looked at it for another moment. Then she looked at him. You said you'd tell me what it was for when it was done. He'd thought about how to say this for weeks, and had arrived at the conclusion that thinking about how to say something was often just fear wearing the costume of preparation. So he said it simply, "It's for you." She went still. "I'm not giving it to you because you're a client, or because I owe you something, or because of what we've built professionally," he said. "I'm giving it to you because I made it with no deadline and no commission for the same reason I fell for you. Because some things exist not because they're needed, but because they're right. Because the making of them is the point." He paused. "I made it over the same period of time that I was figuring out that I was in love with you. I didn't plan that. It's just what happened." Victoria looked at him. The workshop was quiet around them. Just the morning, settling sounds of the building, the distant street noise, the light coming through the clerestory windows the way it always did. "Say it again," she said. "Which part?" "The last part." He held her gaze. "I'm in love with you." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she closed the distance between them and put both hands flat on his chest and kissed him. Not briefly this time. Not the restrained first version in her kitchen over material samples. This was the real thing, the version that had been accumulating for 8 months and had finally arrived at its destination. When she pulled back, she kept her hands where they were and looked at him from close. Her eyes were still doing the almost but not crying thing. "I love you," she said. "I have for a while. I was waiting until I was sure I wasn't going to say it wrong." "There's not a wrong way to say it." "There is for me," she said. "I needed to say it when I meant exactly that and nothing extra." She looked at him steadily. "I mean exactly that, nothing extra." "I know," he said. "That's why it means what it does." She laughed then. The real laugh, unguarded, the one that had been coming out more and more over the past months. And he pulled her in and held her, and she let herself be held, and they stood in his workshop next to the cherry chest in the June light and were exactly where they were supposed to be. Not perfect, not solved, but true. 3 weeks later, Caleb found out. Not in a planned conversation. Mason had been working up to the planned conversation, had actually rehearsed portions of it in the mirror, which was something he'd never in his life done before, and which he was not proud of, but which felt necessary given the stakes. He'd planned to sit Caleb down on a weekend afternoon and explain things in an age-appropriate and honest way that respected his son's intelligence without burdening him with adult complexity. What actually happened was that Caleb came into the kitchen on a Tuesday morning before school and found Victoria at the stove making eggs. Mason had been in the shower. Victoria had let herself in. She had a key by this point, another small practical thing that had become large, and had noticed there was no evidence of breakfast being made and had made breakfast, which was something she did now without ceremony when she was there in the morning. Caleb had come downstairs in his school clothes and stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. Victoria looked at him. She turned the eggs and said, "Good morning, you want toast?" Caleb looked at the eggs, looked at her, looked at the key on the counter that was not on his father's keychain, did some math that Mason, arriving downstairs 10 minutes later with damp hair, could see had already been completed. "You're here in the morning," Caleb said to Victoria. "Yes." "You made eggs." "Your dad was in the shower." Caleb turned to Mason, who had stopped in the doorway with the specific arrested quality of a man who had arrived too late for the setup and was now inside the scene. "Is she your girlfriend?" Caleb asked, with the directness of a 9-year-old who had decided the most efficient route was a straight line. Mason sat down at the kitchen table. "Yes," he said. "We were going to talk about it this weekend." Caleb considered this. He looked at Victoria, who had turned back to the stove with the composure she brought to things that required it, but was clearly paying close attention to the room behind her. "Did you know he was going to say that?" he asked her. "We've talked about it," she said. "But you didn't know he was going to say it today." "No, I didn't plan this." Caleb sat down across from his father. He put his backpack on the chair next to him. On the chair, not the floor, which meant he was paying attention to appearances in a way he only did when something felt significant. "For how long?" he asked Mason. "For a while. A few months." "Is it?" Caleb stopped. He looked at his hands on the table, then back up. "Is it serious?" The word sounded strange in his 9-year-old voice. Serious. Like a word borrowed from adult conversation, which it was. Mason looked at his son's face and thought about all the things Caleb carried that a kid his age shouldn't have to carry. The knowledge that his parents' marriage had failed, the experience of watching two people who were supposed to be permanent become separate, the specific wariness of a child who had been close to something falling apart and didn't want to stand close to something that might fall apart again. "Yes," Mason said. "It's serious." Caleb absorbed this. Victoria came to the table with 2 plates, eggs for Mason, eggs for Caleb, the same eggs she'd made that first morning for Mason, which now Mason understood was just how she made eggs, not a special occasion version, and sat down with her own coffee. "Does Mom know?" Caleb asked. "She knows I've been seeing someone," Mason said carefully. "She hasn't been told all the details. That's adult stuff, Caleb, not your job to manage." "I know." He looked at Victoria. "Do you like my dad?" "Very much," she said. "He talks about you," Caleb said. "He doesn't say a lot, but I can tell." "He talks about you too," she said. "All the time. About school and the workshop and the bioluminescence documentary." Caleb blinked. "He told you about the fish?" "In detail." Something loosened in Caleb's face. Not resolved. He was 9, not simple. But the tension that had been in him since he came downstairs and found someone in his kitchen released a fraction. He picked up his fork. "The anglerfish use their light to catch prey," he said, "which is kind of messed up if you think about it. Using the thing that draws you in to..." He made a gesture. "Yeah," Victoria said. "That is kind of messed up. Dad says some things that attract you aren't actually good for you." A silence. Mason looked at his son, who was looking at his eggs with the expression of someone who had not intended that sentence to land the way it had, but was watching it land anyway. "Your dad's pretty smart," Victoria said, without any particular weight on it. "Sometimes," Caleb said. "He's also wrong about a lot of things." "Everyone is," she said. Caleb looked up at her. He smiled, small, reluctant. The smile of a kid who had decided something was okay before he was entirely ready to admit he'd decided it. Then he ate his eggs. Mason sat at his kitchen table in the Tuesday morning light and thought that he did not deserve this, but not because he was unworthy of it, but because deserving implied a transaction, a balance of merit and reward, and what was actually happening was not a transaction. It was just life working in the direction of good for a change, which was not something you earned. It was something you showed up for and then were careful with. He was going to be very careful with it. The summer moved through Hartwell City the way good summers did. Slow enough to live in, fast enough to make you pay attention. Caleb was out of school by the 3rd week of June, and Mason adjusted the workshop schedule to accommodate the new rhythm of having a kid around all day, which he'd done every summer for 3 years, and which he still found more rewarding than inconvenient, even when Caleb knocked things off shelves or asked a question every 4 minutes. Victoria's firm had a strong season. The 2 new commissions she'd mentioned at the Foss dinner both launched, and a 3rd came in through a referral from Patricia Foss in July, which was exactly the kind of client pipeline that sustainable firms were built on. She was busy in the way she was always busy. Not frantic, not drowning, but running at capacity in a way that required management. Mason had gotten good at reading the signs. The second coffee, the slightly longer pauses in conversation, the way she looked at her phone more frequently. When he saw those signs, he did things. He made dinner when she came over instead of suggesting they go out. He took Caleb to his mother's on Saturday afternoon so Victoria could have the house quiet for a few hours. Once he came to her office at 7 in the evening with food from the place on Meridian that she liked and sat in her conference room while she finished a call and then ate with her at the conference table while she unwound. She told him, the 3rd time he did something like that she wasn't used to it. "People taking care of you?" he asked. "People noticing I needed it without being told." "You're not hard to read. You think you are." She looked at him over her food. "I've been told I'm difficult to read." "By who?" She thought about it. "Several people." "Then several people weren't paying attention." She was quiet for a moment. "Or I was performing being fine well enough that they believed the performance." "That too," he said. "You're good at it, but you slip." He took a bite. "You get a specific look when you're tired and trying not to show it. Your left hand does something." She looked at her left hand. "What does it do?" "Closes, like this." He demonstrated, a slight curl of the fingers, not a fist, just a partial closing. "You do it when you're holding something." She stared at her hand. I didn't know that. Most people don't know their own tells, he said. It's fine. I'm not cataloging it to use against you. I'm cataloging it because you matter to me, and that's what you do when someone matters. She looked at him for a long moment. You're going to make this very hard for me, she said, in a tone that meant the opposite of what the words said. I know, he said. You'll survive it. She shook her head, almost smiling. Eat your food. It was in late July, on a Sunday, that Mason saw Sabrina again for the first time since February. He'd been thinking about it less. That was the truest thing he could say. Not that he'd stopped thinking about it, not that the old friction had entirely gone quiet, but that the frequency had dropped and the intensity had dropped, and when he did think about it, the thoughts completed themselves faster and released cleanly rather than circling. He'd had a brief conversation with Sabrina in May, phone only, about Caleb's summer schedule, and she'd been contained. Sober, he thought, less edge in her voice. She'd asked one question about how Caleb was adjusting to things, and he'd answered it honestly, and she hadn't pushed further, and they'd ended the call in about 12 minutes, which was a record. He'd mentioned to no one that the call had felt different. He was superstitious about saying things like that out loud before he had more evidence. The July Sunday happened at a cafe in the West Side District, where he and Victoria and Caleb were having a late breakfast. It was the kind of Sunday that earned its name. Warm without being heavy. The light doing something specific with the cafe's wooden interior that made Mason look at the joinery on the window frames, the occupational hazard he'd had for 20 years. Caleb was working on a large stack of pancakes with the focused intensity he brought to food he genuinely liked. Victoria was reading something on her phone that was probably work-related, but that she'd given herself permission to read at breakfast because it was Sunday, and the line she maintained between work and not work was real but not rigid. Mason looked up through the cafe window. Sabrina was on the other side of the street. She was walking, not heading anywhere in particular, it seemed, just moving through the Sunday morning the way people did when they were out without a destination. She was with someone, a woman Mason didn't recognize, and she looked. He watched her for the few seconds before she looked across the street and their eyes met. Okay. Not performing okay. Actually okay, or some version of it. She was dressed simply, no cigarette, walking at the pace of someone who wasn't running from anything. Their eyes met. He didn't look away. She didn't look away. About 3 seconds passed in which everything that had happened between them, the marriage and the divorce and the parking lot and the February morning outside Victoria's house and every conversation and argument and the grinding friction and the years of it, sat in the space between them, compressed into something that couldn't be said and didn't need to be. Sabrina's eyes moved from him to Victoria, who was still reading, and then to Caleb, who was still with his pancakes. She looked at the three of them together at the cafe table for a moment. Something moved in her face that Mason couldn't fully read from across the street, but it wasn't anger. It wasn't the wound-up energy of someone preparing. It was something quieter and more tired and more honest. She looked back at Mason. She gave him a small nod. Not friendly, not unfriendly, acknowledging. The kind of nod you gave when you had decided to let something be what it was. He nodded back. She walked on. He sat with what had just happened for about 30 seconds. He was aware that his heart rate had elevated and was now lowering. He was aware that he'd braced for something, some familiar frequency, and that it hadn't come. Caleb looked up from his pancakes. Was that Mom? He asked. Yeah. She didn't come over. No. Caleb looked out the window in the direction she'd gone, then back at his pancakes. He took another bite. Okay, he said, in the tone of a 9-year-old filing something under noted but not urgent. He went back to the pancakes. Victoria had looked up from her phone. She looked at Mason with a question in her face. Not probing, just present, offering the space for whatever he needed. I'm fine, he said. And then, because she told him that performing fine and actually being fine were two different things, that was different. She just walked away. She saw us, and she walked away. Victoria nodded slowly. People sometimes get there, she said, in their own time. I know. He looked at his coffee. I didn't think she would. I kept waiting for the next thing. The next version of the parking lot, the next text, the next... He stopped. I think I've been waiting for the next thing for so long that I stopped noticing it hadn't come. It's hard to stop bracing, Victoria said. When you've been bracing for a long time, the absence of threat feels like a trick. Yeah. He looked at her. When did that stop for you? The bracing. She thought about it seriously. I'm not sure it stopped all at once, she said. I think I just started having more moments where I wasn't doing it, and eventually the moments were longer than the bracing. He nodded. He looked at his son, who was now building a small structure out of the remaining piece of pancake and a pat of butter in a way that probably wasn't what the table was for, but which Mason decided not to address. Caleb, he said. Yeah, I love you. Caleb looked up. He processed this. Not the words themselves, which he heard regularly and believed, but the timing of them, the specific Sunday morning cafe weight of them. He was 9, and he understood subtext better than most adults gave him credit for. I love you too, Dad, he said. Then, because he was 9, can I get another pancake? One more. He flagged down the server. Victoria's hand under the table found Mason's and held it without making an announcement of it, which was how she did everything that mattered. He held her hand back. The summer finished itself out, and September came in with cooler air and the particular quality of light that early fall brought to Hartwell. Lower angle, longer shadows, the city going amber in the afternoons. Caleb went back to school and came home with new opinions about his teacher and a project about local ecosystems that required a visit to the eastern wetlands that Mason took him on a weekend. Just the two of them, which Caleb declared the best Saturday in recent memory. A ranking he revised fairly frequently, but which Mason appreciated regardless. The cherry chest had been at Victoria's house since the morning he'd given it to her. She'd put it in the front room at the foot of the stairs, where it caught the morning light from the east-facing windows and darkened incrementally every week the way Cherry did. He noticed the darkening every time he visited. He told her it would keep doing that for years, deepening, going richer, and she'd said she was counting on it. One September evening, they were sitting on the terrace behind her house. Victoria had extended it over the summer. New stone laid, a timber pergola she'd designed herself, a garden below it that had been barren since she bought the house and was now planted with things that would actually grow. She'd done the planting herself, which she'd approached with the same research-heavy methodology she brought to everything. Read 3 books about it, made a plan, executed the plan, and then deviated from the plan based on actual conditions, which she'd told Mason afterward was good professional practice in any discipline. The evening was the kind that September produced occasionally as a reminder of what it could do before it retreated into fall. Warm, still, the air carrying the smell of the turned garden and the city below, and something that was just autumn in the making, not there yet, but coming. The city spread out below the terrace in its evening lights, the vertical glitter of the downtown high-rises and the low spread of the residential neighborhoods, and the particular way Hartwell City looked from elevation, which was like a place that had been making itself for a long time and was still going. Victoria was sitting with her legs across the arm of her chair in the particular graceless way that she sat when she was genuinely comfortable, which he'd come to consider a meaningful signal. She had a glass of wine that had been at about the same level for 40 minutes. Mason had a beer. There was music from inside the house, low enough to ignore, present enough to feel. I keep thinking about something, she said. What? The night I sent Jade home with you, the night we met. He looked at her. You sent her... You didn't send her with me. She called a wrong number. I know, but when you pulled up and I came to the door, you were already putting the truck in gear. She was looking at the city. You were going to leave. You'd done the thing you came to do, and you were leaving. I wasn't expecting you to come to the window. I wasn't planning to, she said. She turned to look at him. I saw a man who had come out in the rain for a stranger for no reason, except that he had a kid and knew what it was to need someone to show up. And I thought... She stopped, started again. I thought, invite him in for coffee, Victoria. It's raining. Invite him in. And I'm glad I did. She said it simply, without embellishment. I think about all the ways it almost didn't happen. You almost didn't answer the phone. You almost didn't come. You almost drove away. I almost drove away, he confirmed. That one bothers me the most, she said. That one. Why? She looked at him. Because you would have gone home and been fine. You were managing. You had Caleb in the workshop, and you were managing life. You wouldn't have known what you'd missed because you wouldn't have known I existed. And you? She was quiet for a moment. I would have been the same, she said. Successful and efficient and completely alone in the way that doesn't show on the outside. She turned her wine glass in her hand. I think about how many people live like that, building good lives that are missing something they can't see because they've never been close enough to it to know what it looks like. He looked at the city lights. The thing about peace, he said, is that I used to think it was boring. I used to think if nothing was wrong, nothing was really happening. He exhaled. Sabrina she created weather, drama, tension, always some version of emergency that needed managing. And I confused that for aliveness. I thought intensity meant depth. It doesn't, she said. No, it really doesn't. He looked at his beer. Depth is boring on the outside. Depth is someone noticing your left hand closes when you're holding something hard. Depth is making eggs. Depth is sitting on a dusty floor helping a kid measure chair legs. He glanced at her. It doesn't announce itself. That's the whole thing. It doesn't announce itself. She was looking at him with the quality of attention he had never stopped being affected by. The full, unhurried kind that made him feel actually visible rather than just present. I want to ask you something, she said. Okay. And I want you to know you don't have to answer a specific way. I'm asking because I need to know where you are, not to lead you anywhere. He put his beer down. Ask. Where is this going? For you. She kept his gaze. Not what you think I want to hear. What you actually see. He was quiet for a moment. Not because he didn't know, he'd known for a while, but because the knowing deserved a moment before the saying. I see a life, he said, with you in it, with Caleb in it, with the work in it, and the mess and the things that are going to go wrong that we don't know about yet. He paused. I'm not in a hurry for labels. I don't need to define everything right now, but I need you to know that when I look forward, I see you there, not as a possibility, as a thing I'm building toward. She looked at him for a long moment. I see the same thing, she said. Okay. Okay. They sat with that for a while, the way they sat with things that mattered, without rushing past them or over-explaining them or requiring them to be more than they were. The city made its evening sounds below them. The garden she'd planted was settling into its first fall. Inside the house, the cherry chest sat at the foot of the stairs, going slowly, incrementally darker in the way that cherry did, patient, time-dependent, the kind of beautiful that required waiting for. I want to say something else, she said. Yeah. I spent a lot of years thinking I was self-sufficient, that I didn't need... She stopped, chose the right word. Partnership, not in the professional sense, the other sense. I thought needing it was weakness. It's not. I know that now. I knew it intellectually for a while, but knowing it intellectually and knowing it in your actual life are different. She looked at the pergola she'd designed, the timber joints she'd detailed herself, the things she'd built because she'd wanted to build something for its own sake. You changed something in me. I want you to know that. Not because you tried to change me, because you just were who you are, consistently. And standing next to that for long enough made me see some things differently. He thought about Caleb asking if she was nice, and him saying, yeah, she's nice, and how inadequate that had been even at the time. You changed something in me too, he said. I came into this still half believing that showing up and being steady wasn't enough, that love required more performance, more drama. He shook his head. You never performed anything. Not once. And after a while I stopped feeling like I should. She smiled at that, the real one. We're both a lot of work, she said. We really are. I think that's fine. I think so too. She uncurled herself from the graceless chair position and stood up, stretching, and he stood with her because the evening had reached the natural end of sitting and the natural beginning of something else. And she moved to the terrace railing and he stood next to her and they looked at the city together in the dark. This city that had put a rain-soaked young woman in front of the wrong phone number and a tired man in a truck on a street he had no reason to be on and a woman in a doorway who had decided, in some instant of unplanned judgment, to walk off her porch into the rain and knock on a stranger's window. He thought about all the ways it almost hadn't happened, all the almost didn't answers, almost didn't drives, almost drove aways. The sheer accumulation of small decisions that had to go a specific direction for any of it to exist. He thought about what his mother had said, don't let careful turn into afraid, and about how long he'd been afraid without knowing he was afraid because he'd dressed the fear in the clothes of caution. He thought about the cherry chest at the foot of the stairs. 14 months of building, built with no plan and no deadline, built for the maker first, which turned out to be the only way to make something truly worth giving. He thought about Caleb on a dusty floor measuring chair legs, absorbing without knowing he was absorbing what it looked like when someone took you seriously. The most important education was always the incidental kind. He thought about Sabrina walking away on a Sunday morning and the small nod that meant whatever it meant. That she was getting there, maybe, finding her own version of forward, maybe. He hoped that for her, not for his own sake anymore. Just because she was a person, and persons deserve to find their way through. And he thought about what he'd learned over 14 months and one rainy October night, and a woman who made eggs without being asked, and a boy who thought burlwood was like people. The lesson that no one teaches you because it doesn't have a clean shape until you've lived it. The loudest things in your life are not always the most important ones. The person who generates the most weather is not the one who is most alive. Intensity is not depth. Electricity is not warmth. The difference between a relationship that feels important and one that actually is can look from the outside like the difference between a bonfire and a lamp. One makes more impression, one lets you see where you're going. He'd spent years drawn to the bonfire. He understood why. The bonfire was beautiful, and it was warm, and it made everything around it visible in that specific dramatic way that felt like meaning. The problem with bonfires was what they cost, the fuel they required, the way they left nothing behind them except ash and the memory of heat. He was done with bonfires. He was standing on a terrace in the September dark next to a woman who had never once tried to set anything on fire, who had built something real with nothing but precision and patience and the willingness to open a door when the right person finally knocked, who had looked at a 9-year-old's half-formed furniture and sat on a dirty floor and taken him seriously, which was the most quietly radical act of care Mason had ever witnessed. The city below them was loud and various and entirely indifferent to the two of them standing at its edge. It had been going before them and would go after them, the way cities did, cycling through its losses and arrivals without keeping score. Victoria took his hand, not dramatically, just took it. He held it. That was all. That was everything. There was no single moment where Mason Reed understood that he had his life back, or more accurately, that he had a life now, the real one, the one that fit. It happened the way the cherry wood darkened, gradually, in the light, through ordinary time. He noticed it in increments, in the specific quality of Tuesday mornings in the workshop when he could hear her voice from the front office where she'd started working 2 days a week so they could be close without being in each other's way. In the sound of Caleb laughing at something Victoria said from another room, in the Sunday dinners at his mother's house that had become a standing thing, the four of them around the table, Caleb explaining things he'd learned that week with the evangelical energy of a child who believed information was a gift. In the way he woke up in the mornings without the first thought being something to manage or something to fear. In the absence of grinding friction. In the discovery, slow and surprising, that peace was not the opposite of feeling, that it was just feeling at a temperature you could survive. The door had opened. He'd walked through. There'd been no announcement, no ceremony, no single moment of arrival. Just this. Just the ordinary, extraordinary accumulation of choosing to stay.